The letter said he needed a wife. It didn't say there'd be three of them. Three brothers, shoulders wide as door frames, standing on a frozen platform in the middle of nowhere, Colorado. She had $100 sewn into her cloak and a monster waiting for her back in Boston. They were offering her something impossible, something no decent woman would even consider. And God help her, you was considering it. This is the story of Eleanor Whitfield and the choice that changed everything. She stepped off the train into nothing. Not nothing the way a city person means it, not an empty street or a quiet afternoon. Nothing the way the wilderness means it. No buildings taller than a man, no cobblestones, no gas lamps or carriages or church bells marking the hour. Just a wooden platform barely wide enough for two people to stand side by side, a single dirt road cutting through a handful of rough structures, and beyond that mountains. Mountains so massive, so indifferent to everything human, that Eleanor Rose Whitfield felt her own existence shrink to something no larger than a heartbeat. The cold hit her next. Boston was cold. Boston in January could freeze the Charles River solid enough to walk on, could turn breath to crystal, could make a woman's fingers ache through kid leather gloves. But Boston's cold was civilized. It stayed outside where it belonged, kept at bay by brick walls and coal fires and the thick insulating layers of society. This cold was different. This cold had teeth. It bit through her traveling cloak, through the navy blue wool of her best remaining dress, through her cotton undergarments straight down to bone. It found the gaps between her buttons, crept up her sleeves, wrapped around her throat like fingers. Within 30 seconds of stepping off that train, Eleanor could no longer feel her toes. She clutched the handle of her small leather trunk with both hands, knuckles white, and looked around the platform of Elk Ridge, Colorado. The letter had promised a home. The letter had promised comfort and security. The letter had not mentioned that the nearest thing to civilization was this cluster of rough wooden buildings that looked like they might blow away in a strong wind. It had not mentioned that the mountains surrounding this place made it feel like standing at the bottom of a well, small and trapped and very far from the sky. And it certainly, most certainly had not mentioned that waiting on the platform to meet her would be not one man, but three. Three. They stood in a loose half circle near the edge of the platform, and they were the largest human beings Eleanor had ever seen in her life. Not heavy, not soft. Built on a scale that seemed designed for a different world than the one she had come from, a world where size meant survival and strength was not decorative but necessary. All three stood well over 6 feet tall. All three had shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. All three wore heavy coats and work boots and wide-brimmed hats pulled low against the cold. And all three were looking directly at her. Eleanor's heart, which had been beating too fast since somewhere around the Kansas border, stopped entirely. The one in the center moved first. He came forward with a walk that did not match his size. A big man should move heavily, should announce himself with the thud of boots and the creak of floorboards. This man moved like something that hunted for a living, each step placed with deliberate precision, weight balanced silent despite the frozen planks beneath his feet. He stopped 10 feet away and removed his hat. The face underneath was not handsome, the way men in Boston were handsome, with their smooth cheeks and pomaded hair and carefully cultivated expressions of bored superiority. This face had been carved by weather and war and hard years into something more honest than handsome. Square jaw covered in 2 days of dark stubble, high cheekbones that caught the flat winter light, a nose that had been straight once before someone or something broke it, and it healed with a slight ridge at the bridge. And eyes the color of wood smoke, gray and shifting, and so intensely focused on her face that Eleanor felt pinned in place like a moth on a collector's board. Miss Whitfield. His voice matched his size deep enough that she felt the vibration of it in her own chest the way she sometimes felt thunder before she heard it. I'm Silas Calloway. These are my brothers. The word registered, slowly fighting through layers of cold and fear in the sheer, overwhelming reality of her situation. The man to Silas's right stepped forward, younger by a few years, with longer brown hair that touched his collar and brown eyes that held none of his older brother's granite intensity. Where Silas looked at her like he was trying to solve a problem, this man looked at her like she was a person who had just traveled a very long way and might need to sit down. I'm Bridger, ma'am. He touched the brim of his hat. Folks call me Bridge. Welcome to Colorado. His voice was softer than his brother's, but carried the same depth, the same rumble of something powerful held carefully in check. There was warmth in it, and Eleanor, who had not felt warm in any sense of the word for longer than she could remember, found herself leaning toward that warmth the way a frozen traveler leans toward fire. The third brother did not step forward. He leaned against a post at the edge of the platform with a stillness that reminded Eleanor of a coiled spring, all that energy compressed in waiting. His hair was darker than his brother's, but shot through with threads of copper that caught the fading light. His eyes were green, bright, and sharp as new grass in spring, and they were studying her with an intensity that was different from Silas's grim assessment or Bridger's gentle concern. This was curiosity bordering on delight. Colt Calloway, miss. He grinned, and there was something wild in it, something untamed that the other two kept buried. His voice carried a note of mischief. You're even prettier than your photograph. And that's saying something because that was a mighty fine photograph. Three brothers, all introducing themselves, all looking at her like she was the answer to a question she had not heard asked. Eleanor set her trunk down on the frozen platform, straightened her spine despite the wind cutting through her like a blade, and spoke with a steadiness she absolutely did not feel. Gentlemen, I believe there has been some misunderstanding. Your advertisement mentioned seeking a wife. Singular. I assumed that meant one of you was looking for marriage. Not all three. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. The brothers exchanged glances, some wordless communication passing between them that spoke of years, decades of shared life, shared decisions, shared everything. Eleanor watched it happen and felt simultaneously fascinated and excluded, the way a person feels watching a conversation in a language they do not speak. Then Silas spoke, and his words changed everything. No misunderstanding, Miss Whitfield. We're all three looking for a wife. The same wife. We share everything on this mountain. The ranch, the work, the profits. And if you agree to stay, we'd share the responsibility of caring for you too. You'd be my wife by law, but in truth, you'd belong to our family. All three of us. He let that settle. Let the wind fill the silence while Eleanor's mind tried and failed to process what he had just said. If that doesn't suit, he continued, and his voice held no judgment, no pressure, only a flat statement of fact, we'll pay for your ticket back on tomorrow's train. No hard feelings. But you need to decide soon. Storm's coming, and it's a 20-mile ride to the ranch. We need to leave now. Eleanor stared at him, at all three of them. She tried to comprehend what he was saying, tried to fit it into any framework of understanding that her 22 years of proper Boston upbringing had given her. Three brothers, one wife, shared completely. It was insane, it was immoral, it was everything she had ever been taught to fear and reject and flee from. She should have demanded the ticket immediately, should have turned on her heel and marched back to that train and ridden it all the way to Boston and thrown herself on her father's mercy and accepted whatever fate he had arranged for her, because at least that fate had the decency to involve only one man, even if that man was a monster. But she did not demand the ticket. She did not turn. She did not march. Instead, standing on that frozen platform at the edge of the known world, Eleanor Rose Whitfield felt something she had not expected, something that had no place in the repertoire of emotions available to a proper young woman of her former station. Curiosity. And underneath that buried deep something that might have been the very first stirring of hope. I will need time to think about this, she said, and her voice barely carried over the wind. Bridger stepped forward, bent, and picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing at all, like it was empty instead of packed with everything she owned in the world. You'll have it, he said gently. Let's get you out of this cold before you freeze. The wagon's this way. She had until morning to decide. And that decision would change everything or end everything. But some choices, the hard ones, the impossible ones, those are the ones worth making. Before we go on, if you're new here, I tell stories like this every week. Frontier tales about people who risk everything for a chance at something real. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment down below. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I love hearing from you, every single one. Now, to understand how Eleanor Rose Whitfield came to stand on that frozen platform facing three mountain men and an impossible choice, we need to go back. Back 2 weeks, back across half a continent, back to the moment her carefully constructed world began to crumble. Boston, Massachusetts, January the 1st, 1884. The fire in the great hearth of Cornelius Whitfield's study did nothing to warm the chill spreading through his daughter's body. Eleanor stood across the desk from her father, hands clasped in front of her, watching him sign documents with the focused attention of a man conducting ordinary business, which from his perspective, he was. The fact that the documents in question sold his only daughter to a stranger was to Cornelius simply a matter of practical necessity. Outside the window, snow fell on Beacon Hill in thick, silent curtains. Beautiful and suffocating, the way everything in Eleanor's life had been beautiful and suffocating for as long as she could remember. "You'll marry him in 6 weeks, Margaret. It's already arranged." Cornelius Whitfield did not look up as he spoke. He had stopped calling her Eleanor 3 years ago, preferring her middle name Margaret, claiming it sounded more dignified, more appropriate for the wife of a British aristocrat. But Eleanor had never answered to it. Not in her heart. In her heart, she was. Eleanor had always been Eleanor would die, Eleanor, no matter what name they tried to stamp on her like a brand on cattle. She had been called many things in her 22 years. Dignified, appropriate, proper, suitable. These were the words applied to Eleanor Whitfield by the women of Beacon Hill Society, and they were applied the way one applies varnish to a piece of furniture, to make the surface acceptable, to cover whatever might be underneath. Never beautiful, never desired, never loved. Those words belonged to other women. Women with dowries and social connections and the good sense to learn needlepoint instead of reading legal texts in their father's libraries. Women who knew their place and stayed in it and never not once asked a question that made the men at the dinner table fall into uncomfortable silence. Eleanor was not one of those women, and her father had never forgiven her for it. "Father, please." Her voice came out steady, a small miracle considering the terror clawing at the inside of her throat. "Please don't do this. Lord Pembroke is nearly 70 years old." Cornelius Whitfield finally looked up from the contract. His face had once been handsome, the kind of Boston Brahmin handsomeness that graced portraits in museum hallways and impressed society matrons at charity galas. But years of bad investments and mounting debt had carved that handsomeness into something harder. The railroad speculation that was supposed to restore the Whitfield fortune had instead consumed what little remained, and the man who sat behind this desk was not the father Eleanor remembered from childhood. That father had been distant but not cruel. This father was something else entirely. 68, actually, and generous enough to forgive $50,000 in debt in exchange for a young bride. His eyes were flat, calculating. The eyes of a man who had stopped seeing his daughter as a person some time ago and now saw her only as an asset to be liquidated. "You should be grateful, Margaret. Most men wouldn't want damaged goods." Damaged. The word hit like a physical blow. Eleanor was damaged only in that she had committed the unforgivable sin of having a mind and using it. She had read every law book in her father's library by the age of 19, had taught herself contract law and property rights and the basics of corporate structure by 20, had asked questions at dinner parties that made her father's business associates shift uncomfortably in their chairs because the questions were incisive, were the kind of questions their own associates should have been asking but weren't. For this she was damaged. For this she was being sold. She thought of Lord Reginald Pembroke, who had visited their home twice. She could still feel the ghost of his touch on her hand during that first introduction. Liver-spotted fingers that trembled with something that was not age. Breath that carried the smell of decay masked poorly by expensive wine. Eyes that had moved over her body with cold calculation, assessing not beauty, but utility. Breeding potential. He'd had 4 wives before her. Eleanor's mother's friends had whispered about it when they thought she couldn't hear back, when her mother was still alive, back when there was still someone in this house who saw Eleanor as something worth protecting. Weak constitutions. That was the official explanation for why all 4 of Lady Pembroke's predecessors had died within 5 years of their weddings. Weak constitutions. As if 4 healthy young women had simply wilted under the strain of marriage to a wealthy aristocrat like flowers that couldn't handle too much sun. But the whispers told different stories. Stories of a man whose appetites ran to the cruel, whose treatment of his wives left them broken in body and spirit long before their bodies finally gave out. Stories that no one would confirm publicly because Lord Pembroke was rich and titled and powerful, and the women he destroyed were dead and could not testify. "I won't do it." The words escaped before Eleanor could stop them. They came from somewhere deeper than thought, somewhere below the years of obedience training and social conditioning, and the bone-deep understanding that daughters of the Whitfield family did as they were told. "I won't marry him." Cornelius Whitfield's hand cracked across her face with enough force to snap her head to the side. Pain exploded through her cheekbones, sharp and bright and clarifying. Eleanor had been struck before. Her father was not a gentleman, had never been a gentleman, and the deterioration of the family's fortunes had stripped away whatever thin veneer of restraint he had once maintained. But she had never been hit with quite this much force, never with quite this much deliberate hatred. This was not correction. This was punishment for the crime of having a will of her own. "You will do exactly as you are told." Cornelius's voice was as cold as the snow outside the window. "You have been a burden to this family long enough, Margaret. At least now you'll serve some useful purpose. The wedding is set for February the 15th. I suggest you use the remaining time to prepare yourself for your wifely duties." He turned back to his papers, dismissed her as completely as if she had ceased to exist. Eleanor stood there with her hand pressed to her burning cheek and felt something inside her crack. Not break, not yet, but crack. A hairline fracture in the foundation of obedience that had been built into her since birth, brick by brick, rule by rule, strike by strike. And in that crack a word was waiting, a word that had been hiding in the shadows of her mind for years perhaps, for her entire life, waiting for exactly this moment to step into the light. Run. Harder things have been survived, and Eleanor was about to prove it. She left the study without another word, climbed the stairs to her room on the third floor, the smallest bedroom in the house, the one farthest from the heat of the fireplaces, because even the allocation of warmth in the Whitfield household was a matter of hierarchy, and Eleanor ranked somewhere below the furniture. She sat on her narrow bed, stared at the wall, and began to plan. 3 days. Eleanor spent 3 days moving through her father's house like a ghost. She attended dinners where Lord Pembroke's name was spoken with approval. She smiled when expected. She was silent when required. She performed the role of dutiful daughter with the precision of an actress in a play she had been rehearsing her entire life. And all the while, behind the mask, her mind worked with a clarity that was new and frightening and exhilarating. She needed money. She could not access her trust fund. That required her father's signature, and upon marriage it would transfer to her husband anyway, another asset in the great accounting of Eleanor Whitfield's liquidation. But her mother, dead these past 10 years, had left Eleanor something her father didn't know about. A small cache of jewelry hidden in a hat box in the attic, tucked behind a broken rocking chair, and a stack of old linens that no one had touched in a decade. Not the Whitfield family pieces, those had been sold years ago to cover the first wave of debts. These were her mother's personal things. A pearl necklace with a clasp that stuck. Gold earrings shaped like tiny leaves. A ruby brooch no bigger than a thumbnail set in silver that had gone slightly dark with age. Eleanor retrieved them on the second night, moving through the darkened house with the silence of long practice. She'd learned to move quietly years ago, learned that invisibility was the most valuable skill a daughter in this house could possess. The pawnbroker's shop on Fleet Street in the South End was 14 blocks from Beacon Hill, which might as well have been another country. Eleanor wore her plainest cloak with the hood pulled up and walked with the purposeful stride of a woman who belonged where she was going. The man behind the counter had sharp eyes that saw through the cheap cloak to the quality of the woman beneath it. He offered her $200 for everything. Eleanor knew the jewelry was worth at least $500. She also knew she had no leverage, no time, and no other options. She took the money. $200 exactly. She counted it 3 times with steady hands, then hid the bills in the lining of her traveling cloak, sewn into a pocket she created herself with a needle and thread borrowed from the mending basket. She did not know, could not have known, that her father would discover the empty hat box within hours. That in his rage at being robbed by his own daughter, he would report $500 stolen instead of $200, inflating the amount to ensure the crime crossed the threshold for federal prosecution. That this single act of spite would send a hunter across state lines to find her. But that part of the story comes later. On the afternoon of January the 3rd, Eleanor found the advertisement. It was in the Boston Herald 3 days old, left on her writing desk by her Lloyd and used to line the fireplace kindling. Something about it caught her eye as she was about to crumple it. A small notice in the classified section, barely 2 inches of column space, easy to miss entirely. Wife wanted. Successful ranch in Colorado Territory, seeking marriage-minded woman. Remote location, hard work, but comfort and security guaranteed. Inquiries to S. Calloway, Elk Ridge, Colorado. Eleanor read it 3 times. Her heart began to beat faster. Not with fear, though fear was certainly present. With something else. Recognition. The recognition of a door appearing in a wall she had believed to be solid. Colorado. She'd seen photographs in magazines at the lending library. Mountains that scraped the sky. Valleys so wide a person could ride for days without seeing another soul. Space. Distance. Anonymity. Everything Boston was not. And some man, some rancher lonely enough or desperate enough to advertise for a wife in a newspaper 1,000 miles from his front door. It could be a trap. Could be worse than Pembroke. Could be death wearing different clothes. But at least it would be her choice. Her decision. Her mistake if it was a mistake. And that had to count for something. After 22 years of having every aspect of her existence dictated by someone else, the simple act of choosing her own disaster felt like the most radical form of freedom available. Eleanor wrote the letter that same evening. Dear Mr. Calloway, I am writing in response to your advertisement seeking a wife. I am 22 years of age, of good health and moral character, educated, but practical-minded. I find myself in circumstances that make marriage in my current location impossible, and I am seeking a fresh start in the West. I have no family ties that would prevent immediate relocation. I am willing to work hard and learn the skills necessary for ranch life. I ask only for respect and fair treatment in return. If you find my application acceptable, I can arrive in Colorado within 2 weeks of receiving your response. I await your reply with great interest. Respectfully, Eleanor R. Whitfield. She did not mention Boston by name. Did not mention her father or Pembroke or the $50,000 of debt that had determined her market value. Did not mention that she was running for her life from a future she could not name, but knew in the marrow of her bones would destroy her. She had her portrait taken the following morning at a photography studio on Tremont Street. The photographer positioned her by the window where natural light fell across her face. She wore the navy blue traveling dress, the one that brought out the blue of her eyes and pinned her honey blonde hair in a simple style. She tried to look capable and pleasant, and like the kind of woman a Colorado rancher might want to build a life with. She had no idea what that kind of woman looked like, but she tried. She mailed the letter and portrait on January the 4th. The reply came 2 days later. January the 6th, Eleanor's maid brought the telegram to her room, eyes wide with curiosity at a message from Colorado Territory. Eleanor's hands shook as she tore it open. Letter received, stop. Photograph appreciated, stop, arrive. Elk Ridge, January 10th, stop. We will meet you. Stop S. Calloway. Stop, we. We will meet you. Eleanor read the word and felt a flicker of something that might have been unease. But the flicker was small, drowned by the tidal wave of relief and terror and desperate, desperate hope that crashed through her when she realized what this telegram meant. She had 4 days. 4 days to disappear. Eleanor Rose Whitfield left Boston on the evening train January the 6th, 1884. She took one small trunk packed with practical dresses, sturdy boots and the warmest cloak she owned. She left behind the silk gowns that smelled of lavender and old money. Left behind the opera gloves she had never wanted. Left behind the calling cards embossed with the Whitfield name, a name that had been her identity and her prison for 22 years. She left no note, no explanation. Let her father wake to an empty room in wonder. Let Lord Pembroke receive the news that his purchased bride had vanished. Let them all think whatever they wished. The train carried her west through a landscape that changed so gradually she almost didn't notice the transformation until it was complete. Cities gave way to towns. Towns gave way to settlements. Settlements gave way to nothing at all, just snow and space, and a sky so enormous it made her dizzy to look at it. 4 days on the train, 4 days to think about what she had done, what she was doing, where she was going. 4 days to convince herself this was not madness. She tried to picture S. Calloway. Was he old or young, kind or cruel? The telegram had been so brief, a handful of words across 1,000 miles, revealing nothing of the man who had sent them. She had committed her entire future to a stranger based on 3 lines of newspaper print and the overwhelming need to not die slowly in a gilded cage. It could still be a terrible mistake, could still be worse than what she left behind. But at least she told herself as the train rocked westward through the gathering dark, at least it was her mistake, her choice. And after a lifetime of having choices made for her, that small, terrifying freedom was worth more than safety, worth more than certainty, worth more than anything she had ever known. The train pulled into Elk Ridge, Colorado on the afternoon of January the 10th, and Eleanor Rose Whitfield stepped onto the platform with her trunk and her terror and her hope all tangled together so tightly she could not have separated one from the other if her life depended on it, which as it turned out it did. And that brings us back to where we started. 3 mountain men on a frozen platform, a proposition that defied every rule Eleanor had ever been taught, and a choice that would have to be made before morning. But what happened on that wagon ride to the ranch, what happened in the storm that followed, that is what changed everything. And not in the way Eleanor expected, not in the way anyone could have expected. The wagon was a spring wagon, sturdy and weathered, pulled by a pair of Percheron draft horses that stood nearly 17 hands tall and must have weighed close to 1,800 pounds each. They were magnificent animals, even to Eleanor's untrained eye, built for power rather than speed, their thick winter coats dusted with snow, their breath steaming in enormous white clouds. Colt took the driver's seat and the reins. He handled the team with an easy authority that spoke of years of practice, one hand on the leather, the other resting on the brake lever, his body swaying with the rhythm of the wagon the way a sailor sways with the sea. Eleanor found herself seated on the bench between Silas and Bridger. The space was small, barely wide enough for 3 people, and the thick winter coats all of them wore made it smaller still. She tried to maintain proper distance, tried to keep a sliver of space between her body and theirs, but the road was rough and the wagon unforgiving, and within the first mile she had given up the effort. Silas's thigh pressed against hers through layers of wool and cotton. She could feel the heat of him even through the fabric, the solid wall of muscle, the casual unconscious strength. His arm rested on the seat back behind her, not touching, but close enough that she was aware of every shift of his weight, every breath he drew. On her other side, Bridger sat with quiet presence. Once, when the wagon lurched over a frozen rut, his hand caught her elbow to steady her. The touch lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Eleanor felt it for the next 20 minutes, a point of warmth on her arm that glowed like an ember. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the steady clop of hooves on frozen ground, and the wind which was picking up strength with every passing minute. Snow had begun to fall light at first, then heavier, then heavy enough to cut visibility to 50 yards, then 30, then 10. The temperature dropped. Eleanor's breath came in visible clouds. She pulled the borrowed cloak tighter, her own having proven entirely inadequate for Colorado winter, and tried to stop her teeth from chattering. Silas noticed. He did not ask if she was cold. He did not make small talk about the weather. He simply shrugged out of his heavy ranch coat, an enormous thing made of oiled canvas lined with wool, and draped it around her shoulders. The coat swallowed her. It was far too large built for a man who stood 6.5 feet tall and weighed well over 200 pounds of working muscle. The sleeves hung past her fingertips. The hem pulled around her waist. But it was warm. Warm in a way that felt personal, intimate, as if Silas Calloway himself had wrapped his arms around her rather than just his coat. It smelled like him, wood smoke, pine resin, leather worn soft with use. And underneath those frontier smells, something else, something that had no name but was purely unmistakably male. "Thank you," Eleanor said, pulling the coat tighter, trying very hard not to think about how the scent of a man she had met 40 minutes ago was making her feel things she had no vocabulary for. "Can't have you freezing before you even see the ranch," Silas replied. There was a hint of something in his voice that might have been humor, or might have been concern, or might have been something else entirely. Wouldn't be much of a welcome. And then the tree branch fell. It came without warning. A massive limb, heavy with accumulated snow, cracked from its trunk with a sound like a rifle shot and crashed across the road directly in the wagon's path. The Percheron screamed. Eleanor had never heard a horse scream before, and it was a sound she would never forget, raw and primal and terrifying. The animals reared, nearly lifting the front of the wagon off the ground. The wagon lurched sideways, wheels sliding on ice. Eleanor felt gravity shift beneath her, felt the bench tilt at an angle that meant the wagon was going over. She had one instant to understand that she was about to be thrown, and then arms closed around her iron hard, pulling her against a chest as solid as the mountains above them. Silas. He moved with a speed that should have been impossible for a man his size. One arm locked around her waist, the other bracing against the seat. He rolled as they went over the side, turning his body so that he hit the ground first and she landed on top of him rather than beneath the wagon. They crashed into a snowbank. The impact drove the air from Eleanor's lungs. For a long, stunned moment, she could not breathe, could not think, could not process anything beyond the fact that she was alive and pressed against the full length of Silas Calloway's body. His heart was pounding. She could feel it through both their clothes, hammering against her cheek where it rested on his chest. Fast, powerful, very much alive. His arms were still locked around her. He had not let go, had not loosened his grip even after the impact, as if some part of him had decided that holding her was more important than breathing, and had not yet received the update that the danger had passed. Their eyes met. His were the color of smoke in winter. Up close, this close, Eleanor could see flecks of darker gray in them like ash, could see the fine lines at their corners from years of squinting against sun and wind, could see something in them that she did not have a name if for something that looked like it had been waiting behind those eyes for a very long time. "You all right?" His voice vibrated through his chest and into her body, low and rough with adrenaline. Eleanor nodded. She did not trust her voice. She tried to push herself up to restore some semblance of proper distance between them. Silas's arms tightened just slightly, holding her still for one heartbeat longer. Then he released her and helped her to her feet with careful hands. Bridger and Colt were already checking the wagon and the horses. The animals were spooked, but uninjured. The wagon had tipped, but not overturned completely. The branch would need to be cleared before they could proceed. It was Silas who noticed. Eleanor took one step, and pain shot through her left ankle like a bolt of lightning. She gasped and staggered. Would have fallen if Silas hadn't caught her arm. "Let me see." He knelt in the snow and his hands found her ankle through the leather of her boot. His touch was gentle, impossibly gentle for hands that large, his fingers probing with a careful precision that spoke of experience with injuries. He unlaced the boot, partially felt the joint, tested the range of motion, while Eleanor bit her lip against the pain. "Swelling already, not broken, the bone's intact, but you've got a bad sprain. You can't walk on this, not for a few days at the very least. I can manage." Eleanor tried to pull away, tried to take another step. Her ankle folded, and she nearly went down again. "No." Silas stood. He stood, and he looked at her with an expression that left no room for argument. "You can't." And before Eleanor could protest, before she could remind him that she was a stranger he had met less than an hour ago, before she could point out that what he was about to do was entirely improper, and she could not possibly allow it, Silas Calloway swept her into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. Colt's laughter rang out over the wind. Proper went out the window the minute she agreed to come to Colorado, Miss Whitfield. Might as well get comfortable with improper. You're going to be seeing a lot more of it. Silas carried her to his horse, a massive bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a calm disposition that spoke well of its training. He mounted in a single smooth motion, settled Eleanor in front of him in the saddle, and gathered the reins. His arms came around her to hold them, and his body formed a wall of warmth at her back. They rode like that for 8 miles through a blizzard that howled and raged around them. 8 miles with Eleanor pressed against Silas Calloway's chest, surrounded by his heat, his strength, the steady, unshakable rhythm of his heartbeat against her spine. 8 miles during which the world outside the circle of his arms ceased to exist, reduced to nothing but white noise and white snow and the white plume of their mingled breath in the frozen air. Eleanor stopped fighting the closeness somewhere around mile 3, stopped holding herself rigid and straight and proper, and simply leaned back into him, seeking warmth and stability in a world that had become nothing but cold and chaos and motion. Silas's arms tightened around her, just slightly, just enough for her to know he had noticed. Almost there, he murmured against her ear. His lips were close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Just hold on a little longer." Eleanor held on and tried not to think about how right it felt to be held by this stranger. this man who wanted to share her with his brothers, this impossible man on his impossible mountain who smelled like wood smoke and punine and made her feel things she had spent 22 years being told she should never feel. The lights of the ranch appeared through the snow like stars fallen to earth, and Eleanor Rose Whitfield understood in that moment with a clarity that frightened her more than the storm that she was not going to get back on that train in the morning. She did not know yet whether that would prove to be salvation or damnation, but she knew with the certainty of a woman who has crossed 1,000 miles of wilderness to stand at the edge of a new life that whatever came next would be her choice, and that after everything was the only thing that mattered. What happened next at that ranch, what she found waiting inside those walls, and the proposition that three brothers laid before her by firelight while the storm raged outside that changed Eleanor in ways she could never have imagined. But that part of the story is just ahead. And trust me, you are going to want to hear it. What the storm revealed in flashes of lamplight through driving snow was larger than Eleanor had imagined, more substantial, more permanent. This was not some rough frontier cabin thrown together from scrap lumber and desperation. This was a home, built by men who intended to stay. The main house rose 2 stories tall, constructed from timber so massive Eleanor could not imagine the labor required to move it into place. Cedar logs, she would learn later, cut from the high slopes and dragged down the mountain by horse teams in summer, when the ground was soft enough to allow it. The gaps between logs were chinked with a mixture of clay and lime that had hardened over years into something nearly as solid as the wood itself. Riverstone formed the foundation in the 3 chimneys that rose from the roof line, each one breathing a thin column of smoke into the storm. A wide porch wrapped around 3 sides of the house, its boards worn smooth by years of boots and weather, and the kind of daily use that speaks of a place truly lived in. Beyond the house, barely visible through the thickening snow, Eleanor could make out the shapes of outbuildings arranged with military precision. A barn large enough for 20 horses, corrals with fences built from split rail, each post set deep and plumb, a smokehouse, a woodshed stacked to the eaves with split cordwood. Everything maintained, everything in its place, everything speaking of men who took their work seriously and did it well. Silas dismounted first, then lifted Eleanor down from the saddle with hands that were careful around her injured ankle. The front door opened before they reached it, spilling warmth and light into the frozen darkness like a promise. Bridger stood in the doorway. How he had arrived before them, Eleanor did not know, did not care. All she cared about was the wall of heat that rolled over her when Silas carried her across the threshold, heat so sudden and so complete after hours in the cold that her entire body shuddered with the shock of it. "Get her upstairs," Bridger said. "I'll heat water for a bath." Colt appeared from somewhere behind them, stomping snow from his boots. "I'll see to the horses." They moved with a coordination that required no discussion, each brother stepping into his role without hesitation. Seamless, practiced, the machinery of a household that had been running this way for years. Silas carried Eleanor up a staircase made of the same massive cedars as the rest of the house, down a hallway lit by oil lamps and iron brackets to a room at the end. He kicked the door open with his boot and brought her inside. The room had been prepared. Eleanor understood this immediately, understood it the way a woman understands when effort has been made on her behalf. The bed was wide enough for 2 people piled high with quilts that showed the patient handwork of someone who had cared about pattern and color. A fire already burned in the stone fireplace, meaning someone had come up to light it before her arrival, had thought about her comfort before she had even stepped off that train. A wash basin and pitcher sat on a stand beside a small mirror. A bookshelf lined one wall filled with volumes that ranged from agricultural texts to Shakespeare to a well-worn Bible with a cracked leather spine. Whoever these men were, they read. They thought. They valued the life of the mind in a place where the life of the body was demanding enough to excuse any amount of intellectual laziness. That single bookshelf told Eleanor more about the Calloway brothers than 100 conversations could have. Silas set her on the bed with a gentleness that continued to surprise her. He knelt and began unlacing her boots. Eleanor knew she should protest, should insist she could manage the task herself. But her fingers were so cold they would not close properly, and Silas's hands were warm and sure, and surprisingly dexterous for their size, working the frozen laces loose with the patience of a man accustomed to fine work. He removed both boots, then examined her injured ankle again, his fingers probing through her stocking with that same careful precision. Swelling's worse, his jaw tightened. You'll need to stay off this completely tomorrow. Maybe longer, I can't impose. Eleanor's voice sounded thin even to her own ears. Thin and tired, and very far from the steady, dignified tone she had been trained to maintain in all circumstances. You've already done so much. Silas looked up at her. Those steady gray eyes held hers, and in them Eleanor saw something she had not expected to find in the gaze of a mountain rancher in the Colorado wilderness. Intelligence, patience, and a quiet, fierce determination that reminded her oddly of her own. You're not imposing, Eleanor. We invited you here. We want you here. And we're going to take care of you whether you agree to our proposal or not. Understood. Eleanor nodded, found she could not look away. Bridger appeared in the doorway, arms full of towels, steam rising from behind him. Bath's ready in the next room. Can you walk that far, or do you need help? I can manage, Eleanor said. And this time she meant it, though. The 12 feet between the bed and the adjoining room took her 3 times as long as it should have, and sent pain shooting up her leg with every step. The brothers left her alone with the bath. The door closed behind them, and Eleanor sat on a stool beside a copper tub that steamed with water hot enough to redden skin, and the full weight of her situation settled over her like the quilts on that carefully prepared bed. She was alone, in the mountains of Colorado, with 3 men she had met 4 hours ago. Men who wanted to marry her, collectively, completely, in ways she barely understood and could not begin to imagine. She was injured, dependent, vulnerable. Every rule of propriety and self-preservation that had been drilled into her since childhood told her she should be terrified. She was not terrified. She was confused. She was overwhelmed. She was exhausted in a way that went deeper than muscle and bone, down to the very foundation of who she was. But she was not afraid, and the absence of fear in a situation that should have been drowning in it was perhaps the strangest thing that had happened to her since she stepped off that train. The Calloway brothers had given her a choice when her father had given her none, had offered her time when Cornelius had offered her only a deadline, had carried her through a blizzard and prepared a room and heated water for a bath, and treated her injured ankle with hands that were firm but never rough. These were not the actions of men who meant her harm. Eleanor undressed slowly, each movement pulling at her swollen ankle, and lowered herself into the hot water with a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a groan. The heat seeped into her bones, melted the cold that had taken up residence in her body somewhere around the Wyoming border and had not left since. For the first time in 4 days, possibly, for the first time in 4 years, Eleanor felt warm. She closed her eyes. Just for a moment, she told herself. Just for a moment, she would float in the simple, extraordinary pleasure of being warm and clean and safe, and not on a train, and not in her father's house, and not anywhere near Lord Reginald Pembroke. She woke to firelight and the smell of stew. For a long, disoriented moment, Eleanor had no idea where she was. The ceiling above her was wrong, too high, made of wood instead of plaster, and the bed beneath her was wrong too wide, too warm, too comfortable by half. Then memory returned like a wave, and she sat up too quickly. The room tilted. Easy now. The voice came from her left, not Silas's voice, younger, warmer, carrying the particular kind of gentleness that belongs to men who have learned it through proximity to suffering. You've been out a long time. Another few hours in that cold, and we'd have been dealing with frostbite instead of feeding you stew. Eleanor turned her head. Bridger Calloway sat in a high-backed chair beside the bed, long legs stretched out in front of him, a book open on his knee that he had apparently been reading by lamplight while she slept. He smiled when he saw her looking. Not the careful, calculated smile of a man trying to make an impression, but a real smile, the kind that started in his eyes and worked its way down to his mouth, like sunlight breaking through cloud. I'm Bridger, he said as if she might have forgotten. Middle brother. The quiet one, according to Colt, though I have my doubts about how quiet a man can be when his younger brother never stops talking long enough for anyone else to get a word in. How long was I asleep? About 6 hours. It's near midnight. 6 hours. Eleanor looked down at herself and felt heat rush to her face. She was wearing a nightshirt that hung to her knees. A man's nightshirt, soft cotton worn thin with washing, and it smelled of soap and wood smoke and something else. Something masculine and specific, and entirely too intimate. Her traveling dress was gone. Her undergarments were gone. Someone had undressed her while she was unconscious and put her to bed. Who changed my clothes? I did. Bridger's expression did not change. No hint of shame or apology or the kind of performative discomfort that a Boston gentleman would have displayed in this situation, the hand-wringing and the averted eyes, and the elaborate explanations designed to preserve everyone's sense of propriety while accomplishing nothing useful. Bridger simply met her gaze and stated a fact. Your clothes were soaked through with melted snow. The fabric was freezing against your skin. You were showing the early signs of frostbite in your fingers and toes, the kind I saw too many times during the Ute campaign back in '79. Men losing fingers, losing feet because nobody got them warm and dry fast enough. I wasn't going to let that happen to you. You undressed me. The words came out flat. Statement rather than question. I did, and I looked no more than necessary. You needed help, Eleanor. I gave it. That's all. Eleanor waited for the outrage to come. Waited for the horror and the violation and the indignant fury that a woman of her station was supposed to feel when a strange man saw her unclothed. She waited, and what came instead was something entirely different. Gratitude. Quiet, complicated, slightly confused gratitude for a man who had done what needed to be done without making it about himself or his desires, or the elaborate theater of propriety that would have let her lose her fingers to frostbite rather than offend anyone's delicate sensibilities. Thank you, she said, and meant it. Bridger stood, moved to the bedside table, poured water from a pitcher into a glass. Here, drink, just water, nothing more. But you need to stay hydrated after that kind of cold exposure. Eleanor took the glass. Their fingers brushed in the transfer, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, not unpleasant, but startling in its intensity. She drank to cover her confusion. The water was cold and clean and tasted of mountain springs. Bridger settled back into the chair and studied her with those warm brown eyes that seemed to see more than they should, more than Eleanor was comfortable with. There are clean clothes for you on the chair by the window. Mine, so they'll be too big, but they're dry and warm. Come downstairs when you're ready. We'll feed you, and you can tell us what brings a woman of obvious education and breeding to our door in the dead of winter. Eleanor set the glass down carefully. How did you know about my education? About my breeding, as you put it? The corner of Bridger's mouth lifted. We're not fools, Eleanor. Your clothes are expensive, even the ones that are starting to show their age. Your hands have never split wood or scrubbed a floor. You speak like someone who grew up with books, not just read them, but lived with them. And you're running from something, or you wouldn't be here. A woman like you doesn't cross 1,000 miles of winter to marry a stranger, unless whatever she left behind was worse than whatever she might find. He paused. Let the observation settle. We don't need to know what it is, not yet. But eventually, if you stay, you'll tell us. No secrets between us. That's one of our rules. He left before Eleanor could respond, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor lay in the oversized bed wearing the oversized nightshirt and tried to process the last 12 hours. She had fled Boston to escape one impossible situation and landed in another. 3 brothers who wanted to share a wife, who had already seen her at her most vulnerable, injured, unconscious, stripped of the armor of clothing and composure that she had worn her entire life like a second skin. But what Bridger said about rules, about no secrets, about eventually, those words hung in the air long after he left. They implied a future. Implied that staying was not just possible but expected. Implied that these men had thought about this plan for it, built rules for a life that included her. She dressed in Bridger's clothes. The shirt hung past her knees. The trousers required rolling 4 times at the cuffs and creative use of a leather belt to keep them anywhere near her waist. But they were warm and clean, and they carried his scent, which was different from Silas's. Less smoke, more earth. Something herbal, like the dried sage she'd noticed hanging in bundles from the kitchen rafters. She made her way downstairs, slowly using the banister for support, testing her ankle on each step. The main room of the ranch house opened before her, and it was even more impressive than the glimpse she'd caught before exhaustion pulled her under. The ceiling rose to the full height of the second floor, supported by timber beams thick as a man's torso. The stone fireplace dominated the far wall, big enough that Eleanor could have stood inside it without stooping, and the fire blazing within it threw heat and light in equal measure across a room that was rough and masculine and unmistakably a home. Not a showpiece, not a statement of wealth or taste, but a place where life happened, where meals were cooked and eaten, where boots were dried by the fire and books were read by lamplight, and three brothers sat at a long wooden table and made the decisions that kept this mountain enterprise running. All three of them turned when she appeared on the stairs. Silas stood by the fireplace. In full light without the distortion of snow and storm, he was devastating in the way that natural forces are devastating. Not beautiful, not handsome in any conventional sense, but commanding in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with presence. He filled the space he occupied completely, took up not just physical room, but atmospheric room, the way a mountain peak takes up the horizon. His eyes found hers, held them, and something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, an acknowledgement that whatever was happening here was already beyond the control of either of them. Bridger sat at the long table ladling stew into bowls. He looked up and gave her that warm smile again. "You look better. Still half drowned in my clothes, but better. Come eat before you fall down again." And Colt leaned against the far wall with a stillness that was all wrong for a man who radiated as much energy as he did. Like a hawk sitting on a fence post, perfectly motionless, every muscle ready for flight. His green eyes tracked her as she descended the stairs, and there was something in them that Eleanor had not yet learned to read. Not hunger exactly, not danger exactly. Something between the two. Something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Miss Whitfield." Silas's voice pulled her attention back. "You should sit before your ankle gives out again." This time his voice carried no command, only concern. She sat. Bridger pushed a bowl of stew across the table. "Eat. You haven't had a real meal in days and your body needs fuel." Eleanor picked up the spoon. The first bite hit her tongue and she had to fight to keep her composure. Rich, savory, thick with potatoes and root vegetables and chunks of venison that melted on her tongue. She had not realized how hungry she was. Had not eaten since the train, since before the train, since the last mechanical dinner in her father's house, where she had moved food around her plate and pretended to eat while her mind was already 1,000 miles west. She ate 3 spoonfuls, then 4, then 5, forgetting for a moment to be restrained, forgetting that she was supposed to maintain dignity and decorum, forgetting everything except the fundamental animal truth that her body was starving, and this food was exactly what it needed. She caught herself on the 6th spoonful, set down the spoon, straightened her spine, forced herself to meet Silas's eyes with something approaching composure. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. I had planned to arrive in a more professional manner." Silas's mouth moved, not quite a smile, something drier. The memory of a smile or the suggestion that a smile might be possible somewhere in the future if conditions were right. "You arrived, given the weather and the terrain that's professional enough." Colt's laugh was unexpected, rich and genuine and entirely too knowing. "Professional. I like that. Like you're interviewing for a position as governess instead of wife to 3 men you've never met." Heat crawled up Eleanor's neck. "That is exactly what I'm doing. Applying for a position, the position of your wife, or wives. I'm still not entirely clear on the arrangement." "Then let us clarify." Silas leaned back against the wall, arms crossed over the broad shelf of his chest. Bridger and Colt settled into chairs at the table, and suddenly Eleanor was at the center of a semicircle. 3 sets of eyes on her. 3 different shades, smoke in brown and green, but all focused with the same unwavering intensity. "We're ranchers, Eleanor." Silas spoke first, his voice measured, deliberate, like a man who had thought carefully about every word before speaking it aloud. "We run timber operations in these mountains, some of the best land in Colorado Territory. We're successful, prosperous. We've built something here that will last generations. But we're also isolated." Bridger continued, 30 miles from the nearest town. Snowed in half the year. "The road you traveled today is impassable from November to March most years. This winter's been mild by our standards. Most women won't even consider coming out here, let alone staying. Those who do come usually leave within a month. Too lonely, too hard, too far from neighbors and church socials and everything they thought a woman's life was supposed to include. We've tried conventional courtship. Doesn't work. So we decided to try something unconventional. Colt's green eyes held a spark that might have been mischief or might have been challenge, and Eleanor suspected it was both. We placed that advertisement knowing most women would refuse on principle, but we hoped that someone desperate enough or brave enough or curious enough might say yes. And which am I? Eleanor heard herself ask, and the question surprised her with its directness. Desperate brave or curious silence. Then Silas in his voice was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet still on the surface and powerful underneath. All three, probably. Just like we are. All three of us desperate for someone who can handle this life. Brave enough to live in isolation. Curious enough to consider an arrangement that society would call sinful. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap beneath the table where none of them could see. Tell me exactly what you are proposing. No euphemisms. No careful wording. I need to understand precisely what you're asking of me. The brothers exchanged one of those wordless glances. Then Silas nodded and Bridger began to speak. We're proposing that you marry Silas, legally. The ceremony would be binding, recognized by law and church. You'd be Mrs. Silas Calloway on every official document. But here in this house, in truth, you would belong to our family, all three of us. You'd share our lives, our future, our home, all three. All three, Eleanor repeated, testing the words in her mouth like something she was not sure was safe to swallow. You mean I would be part of a family with all three of you? Living together, working together, building a life together? Yes. Colt leaned forward and his voice held no shame, no hesitation, nothing but the clean edge of honesty. We share everything on this mountain, Eleanor. Work, profit, responsibility. And if you agree, we'd share the duty of making you happy. Your safety, your comfort, your future. All three of us together. The directness should have scandalized her, should have sent her stumbling back upstairs to pack her trunk and demand that return ticket to Boston. But Eleanor had spent 22 years drowning in the indirect, the implied, the carefully coded language designed to keep proper ladies ignorant of reality. The Calloway brothers' honesty, blunt and unadorned as a fence post, was more refreshing than it had any right to be. Even as it terrified her, and you've done this before, she forced the question out. Shared a life with a woman in this way. Not like this. Bridger's voice was gentle but unflinching. Never a wife, never someone permanent, never someone we wanted to keep. The word keep sent something through Eleanor that she could not name. She should have objected to being discussed like something that could be kept or released. Instead, she found herself leaning forward. And if I did stay, if I agreed to this arrangement, what would my life look like? Colt leaned forward, and Eleanor recognized the eagerness in his eyes as something more vulnerable than confidence. It would look like this: meals together, work together, building something that matters, having someone to come home to who actually wants to be here. Not because she has to be, because she chose it. Why me? The question came out before she could stop it. You don't know me. You had my photograph in a one-paragraph letter. Why would you offer this to a complete stranger? Silas moved then, pushed off from the wall, and walked toward her with that predator's grace, each step deliberate, until he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He crouched down beside her chair, bringing himself to her level in the proximity of him, the heat and the push and the overwhelming physical reality of Silas Calloway at close range made every nerve in Eleanor's body hum like a plucked string. Because you came. His voice was low, meant for her alone, though the room was small enough that his brothers heard every word. That already tells us something. You're brave enough to cross half a continent alone, smart enough to recognize opportunity when you see it, and desperate enough that whatever you're running from is worse than what we're offering. Eleanor flinched. He had seen through her that easily, stripped away pretense with three simple observations. She should have maintained her composure, should have kept the carefully constructed walls intact. But she had been building those walls for 22 years and she was tired. So tired. And the weight of what she had done, what she was doing, what she had run from, all of it crashed down on her at once, and the walls cracked. And what came pouring through was truth. I'm running from a marriage. She heard her own voice as if from a distance, steady and flat, and empty of the emotion churning beneath the surface. My father sold me to his creditor to settle a debt. Lord Reginald Pembroke. 68 years old. He's had 4 wives before me. All 4 died within 5 years of the wedding. People whisper about what he does to his wives behind closed doors, the kind of things that break a woman. I was going to be wife number 5. The temperature in the room dropped. Not physically, not in any way a thermometer could measure, but Eleanor felt it. Felt something change in the air between her and the 3 men who surrounded her. Silas's face went to stone, not hard in the way of anger, though anger was there. Hard in the way of a man who has just been shown something that offends him, down to the bedrock of who he is. Bridger's hands curled into fists on the tabletop, his knuckles white, the tendons standing out like cables. And Colt, who had been leaning back with studied ease, was suddenly upright, every muscle in his body taut, his green eyes burning with something that looked very much like violence, barely contained. Your father sold you. Silas's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before storms, like livestock, to pay a $50,000 debt. Eleanor's laugh tasted bitter on her own tongue. That's my value, apparently. $50,000. That's what it takes to purchase Eleanor Rose Whitfield and do whatever you want with her for however long she survives it. So you ran, Bridger said softly. I stole $200 from jewelry my mother left me. Money that was mine by right, though my father would call it theft, has called it theft, I'm certain. And yes, I ran, because I would rather take my chances with unknown men in the mountains of Colorado than submit to a man I know will destroy me. Silence filled the room. Heavy, charged, thick with something Eleanor could not name, but could feel pressing against her skin like a change in weather. Then Silas's hand rose, slowly, giving her time to see it coming, giving her every opportunity to pull away, to flinch, to tell him, with her body, what she could not say with words. She did not pull away. His palm cupped her cheek, warm, calloused, careful in a way that contradicted everything about his size. His thumb traced along her cheekbone, following the line of bone beneath skin, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the tenderness of it, at the careful, deliberate care this enormous man was taking with her, as if she were something fragile and precious and worth protecting. We are not monsters, Eleanor. His voice was rough, not with anger anymore, with something else, something that sounded like a promise being forged in real time. We won't hurt you, won't force you, won't break you the way that man would have. What we're offering might be unconventional. It might be something the world would judge harshly if it knew. But it's honest. His eyes held hers, and in them, she saw the truth of what he was saying. Saw it the way she had learned to see truth during 22 years in a house built on lies, not in the words themselves, but in the spaces between them, in the steadiness of the gaze and the absence of performance. You have a choice here, Silas continued. You didn't have one in Boston, but you do now. Stay 2 weeks, learn who we are, see how we live, and at the end you decide, yes or no. If the answer is no, we'll give you enough money to start fresh somewhere else. No obligations, no recriminations. And if I say yes, Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. Then you're ours. Silas's thumb traced her cheekbone once more, a gesture that was already becoming familiar, already anchoring itself in the landscape of her memory. We'll marry you legal and proper. Protect you, provide for you, build a life together, all 4 of us. That's the offer, Eleanor. Take it or leave it, but know that it's real. Eleanor should have pulled away, should have reminded him she had known him for less than a day, that this was all happening too fast, that reasonable people did not make decisions about their entire future based on a bowl of stew and a warm hand on their cheek. Instead, she leaned into his touch, tilted her face slightly unconsciously, seeking more of that unexpected warmth, and felt something inside her chest, that knot she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there, loosen. Just a fraction. Just enough for her to draw a full breath for what felt like the first time in years. I need time. You have it. Silas's hand dropped away, and Eleanor felt the absence like a door closing against the cold. 2 weeks. Use them wisely. Bridger stood and began clearing dishes. You should rest. Your body's been through more today than you realize. We'll talk more tomorrow. Eleanor tried to stand. Her ankle protested immediately, a sharp, bright flare of pain that made her gasp and reach for the table edge. Silas caught her before she made it 2 steps. Without a word, without waiting for the protest he already knew was coming, he lifted her and carried her upstairs. By now, Eleanor had stopped pretending she minded. He settled her on the bed and knelt to check her ankle again, his fingers moving over the swollen joint with the same gentle precision she was coming to expect from him. Everything Silas did, he did with control, with intention, with the focused attention of a man who had learned, probably through hard experience, that carelessness cost more than care ever would. 3 days off this ankle. Minimum. 3 days trapped in bed. Eleanor felt her resolve waver. She could not sit idle for 3 days while her future hung in the balance. Gives you time to observe us from a safe distance. Something shifted in Silas's expression. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one she had seen from him. Watch how we work, how we treat each other, how we live. Decide if you could build a life with men like us. And what will I see? The almost smile deepened. I guess you'll find out. He left. The door closed behind him. And Eleanor lay in the darkness, listening to the storm dying outside and the low rumble of male voices drifting up from below. Three brothers talking about her, about this arrangement, about whatever came next. She fell asleep trying to convince herself she would refuse them, that she would take the money and start fresh somewhere sensible, that this was temporary shelter from a storm, nothing more. Her dreams disagreed. Dreams of smoke-colored eyes and careful hands. Dreams of a voice deep enough to feel in her chest, saying words she could not quite make out but understood anyway. Dreams that felt like coming home to a place she had never been. She woke to sunlight. It poured through the windows like liquid gold, and through that gold she saw for the first time the world she had arrived in. Mountains filled the horizon in every direction, white-peaked and enormous, their slopes dark with pine and spruce and fir. The sky above them was so blue it hurt to look at that particular shade of winter blue that exists only at altitude, only in places where the air is thin enough to strip away every impurity and leave nothing but color. It was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had ever seen. And framed in the window below, Silas Calloway was chopping wood. She watched him for longer than she should have. He had removed his coat despite the cold, working in just a flannel shirt, with the sleeves pushed to his elbows, and even from the second floor Eleanor could see the economy of his movement, the way he placed each log on the chopping block with deliberate precision, the way he read the grain before swinging, finding the line of least resistance, letting the wood tell him where it wanted to split, the way the axe rose and fell in a rhythm as steady as breathing, each stroke landing exactly where he intended, never wasted, never wild. He was, she realized, beautiful in his competence. Not beautiful the way art is beautiful, crafted and composed for the pleasure of the viewer. Beautiful the way a working animal is beautiful. All function, all purpose, every element of his design serving the demands of the life he led. A knock at the door pulled her from the window. Bridger entered carrying a tray that made her mouth water before she even saw what was on it. Eggs cooked perfectly, the whites set, and the yolks still golden and yielding. Bacon cut thick and fried until the edges crisped. Bread still warm from the oven, steam rising from its torn center. And coffee. Coffee so strong and dark it looked like it could stand up on its own and walk across the table. Morning. How's the ankle? Painful, but bearable. Good. Bridger settled into the chair beside her bed, the same one he had occupied last night, and Eleanor had the sense that this was not accidental, that Bridger had claimed this particular post deliberately with intention and commitment. You need to eat. All of that. You didn't have to bring me breakfast in bed. Silas's orders. No weight on that ankle today. Besides, it gives us a chance to talk. Just you and me. His brown eyes were steady, kind. But underneath the kindness was something more serious. I need to know what you're thinking, Eleanor, what you're feeling, whether you're planning to run the minute the storm clears. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. The honesty of his question deserved an honest answer, even if honesty was a luxury she had rarely been able to afford. I'm thinking that I'm in over my head, that this is the strangest situation I have ever been in, which is saying something given that I just fled across the country from a man who collects wives the way other men collect horses. I'm thinking that everything I was ever taught tells me I should leave. And I'm thinking that for the first time in my life, I don't want to do what I was taught. I want to do something else. I just don't know what that something else is yet. Bridger was quiet for a moment, weighing her words carefully with respect for their value. I know this is overwhelming, and I know what we're asking goes against everything proper society says a woman's life should look like. But the rules out here are different, Eleanor. Survival matters more than propriety. Happiness matters more than what society thinks. We're not asking you to defend our arrangement in a Boston drawing room. We're asking you to consider a life where three men are devoted to your well-being instead of one, where you're never alone, never unprotected, never taken for granted. The words wound their way into the hollowed-out places inside her. The places where loneliness lived, where the memory of her father's indifference had carved out caverns that she had learned to walk around but never fill. "Tell me about you," she said, needing to change direction before the intensity of the moment pulled her somewhere she was not ready to go. "About each of you, I need to understand who you are, not just what you're offering." Bridger settled back. Silas is the oldest, 33. He served as cavalry during the Ute campaign in '79, rode with the 4th Regiment into the White River country when the Meeker situation went to hell. What he saw there changed him. He came back harder, more controlled, like he'd decided that if he could just keep everything locked down tight enough, nothing bad could get in. He paused. His eyes went distant for a moment, seeing something that was not in this room. He was engaged before. A woman named Lenora Prescott. She died 6 years ago. Riding accident. Her horse spooked and threw her. Broke her neck. Silas wasn't there when it happened. He'd gone to town for supplies. Came back to find her lying in the corral. He has never forgiven himself for not being there. Never stopped believing that if he'd stayed, if he'd been close enough to grab the reins, she'd still be alive. Eleanor's heart contracted. Not with pity. Silas was not a man who invited pity, but with recognition. She knew what it looked like when a person carried guilt like a second skeleton inside their body. She had seen it in her own mirror often enough. "That's why he's so careful," she said quietly. "So controlled. He's terrified of losing someone else." Bridger nodded slowly. "It's why he almost refused the advertisement. Too much risk, too much chance of caring about someone and watching them disappear. Colt and I had to push hard to convince him. Told him living scared was worse than living hurt. And you, what's your story?" "I was a field medic. Same campaign. Ute campaign '79. Bridger's hands flexed against his knees, an unconscious gesture that Eleanor filed away for later examination. "Saw too many men die on tables I couldn't keep clean enough, from wounds I didn't have the tools or the knowledge to fix. Came back to this mountain thinking I could leave it behind." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that has nothing to do with happiness. "You don't leave a thing like that behind. It follows you. I deal with it by helping. Animals, mostly. Became the nearest thing to a horse doctor this territory has. It's not saving soldiers on a battlefield, but it's something. It's enough to let me sleep at night. Most nights. That's why you help me." Eleanor understood suddenly with a clarity that surprised her. "Not because you were taking liberties, because someone needed help and you are physically incapable of not giving it." Bridger looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the confirmation she already knew was there. And something else. Something he had not said yet. There was more. Something about his own health that he was carrying alone. Eleanor could see it in the slight tension around his mouth and the way his left hand occasionally pressed against his temple when he thought no one was watching. But that confession, whatever it was, belonged to another day, and Bridger was already moving on. "And Colt?" Eleanor asked. "Colt's the youngest, 27, hottest temper, and the biggest heart of any man I've ever known. Got thrown in jail once for beating a man nearly to death. The man had assaulted a Navajo woman outside the trading post in Silver Creek. Thought he could get away with it because of who his family was and who she was. Colt made sure he couldn't walk for 6 months. Spent 6 months in jail himself for the trouble. Came out harder in some ways, softer in others. He doesn't regret it. Never will." Bridger's expression held pride in spite of the violence in the story. He's reckless and impulsive and loyal past the point of reason. He'll make you laugh when you need it most, and he'll drive you to distraction when you need it least. But he'd walk through fire for anyone he loves. And if you stay Eleanor, he'll love you fierce enough to shake the ground. "They sound like good men," Eleanor said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. "They are." Bridger met her eyes. "We all are. Not perfect. Not without scars and mistakes and things we'd do differently if we could go back. But good. And we'd be good to you. Eleanor, if you let us." The days that followed proved him right. Eleanor's ankle healed slowly. 3 days became 5, became 7, and by the end of the first week she could walk without limping. Those stairs still required the banister and a degree of caution that frustrated her independent nature. Each day she learned. Not from books, though the library provided those in abundance, but from watching, from listening. From the gradual accumulating evidence of three men's characters revealed through action rather than words. Colt taught her to split wood on the fourth day. He dragged her outside over Silas's objections, wrapped her in one of his own coats that swallowed her twice over, and stood her in front of the chopping block with an axe that was almost as tall as she was. Don't swing at the wood, he told her, standing behind her, his hands covering hers on the handle to show her the grip. Hands apart. Top hand loose, let it slide down when you swing. And don't try to power through. Read the grain. See where the lines run. That's where it wants to split. Find the weakness and let the axe do the work. Eleanor swung. The axe buried itself in the log and stuck there, the wood refusing to yield. Colt grinned. Again. This time don't fight it. Work with it. She tried again. And on the third attempt felt the log give way beneath the blade, splitting cleanly along the grain, with a satisfying crack that sent two halves tumbling off the block. The surge of accomplishment was absurd. She had split a single piece of firewood. In Boston, that would not have merited a footnote. Here, standing in the mountain air, with her breath steaming and her arms aching, and Colt Calloway grinning at her like she had just performed a miracle, it felt like the most significant thing she had ever done. Bridger taught her the horses. The barn smelled of hay and grain, and the warm, particular scent of horses, a smell Eleanor had encountered in Boston, only from the polite distance of a carriage ride. Here it was immediate, enveloping. Bridger put a brush in her hand and showed her how to work it down from neck to flank, following the direction of the hair, reading the horse's body language as she went. Ears forward means she's curious, he explained, guiding Eleanor's hand along the mare's copper-colored shoulder. Ears back means she's annoyed. Flat back means you should step away and give her space. This one here she's called Copper. She's the gentlest animal on the place. She won't give you any trouble. Copper turned her massive head and pressed her velvet nose against Eleanor's shoulder, breathing warm air through the fabric of her shirt. The gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She likes you, Bridger said softly. Horses know good people. They can feel it. And Silas. Silas taught her the business. He brought her into the ranch office on the sixth day, a small room lined with ledgers and maps and contracts, written in the dense legal language that Eleanor recognized immediately as her native tongue. She had spoken the language of law since she was old enough to read, and seeing it here in this rough frontier office thousands of miles from any courtroom felt like finding a letter from home in a foreign country. Silas spread the timber contracts across the desk and watched her read them. Watched her eyes move across the clauses and subclauses with the focused attention of someone who understood not just what the words said, but what they meant, what they could be used for, where the traps were hidden. This provision here. Eleanor pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the third page. It gives the buyer the right to renegotiate pricing if delivery is delayed by weather, but it doesn't specify whose definition of delay applies. In a bad winter, they could argue that any delivery after November 1st constitutes a delay and demand a 20% reduction. You've been paying thousands more than you should because of this clause. Silas stared at the contract, then at her, then back at the contract. You have a head for this, he said slowly. Better than mine, actually. You're seeing things I missed entirely. I had good teachers. Eleanor turned the page, already scanning the next section. Even if they didn't know they were teaching me. Something changed in Silas's eyes at that moment. The protectiveness was still there, but alongside it, something new had appeared. Something that looked very much like respect. And respect, Eleanor was learning, was the foundation on which Silas Calloway built everything. Built this with our own hands, he said quietly, and Eleanor understood that he was not talking about the contract or the office or even the ranch. Every fence post, every beam, and it's still standing. On the fifth night, Eleanor woke to find herself alone in the dark, drawn downstairs by a sound she could not identify. She found Silas sitting by the dying fire, his head in his hands. The iron control that defined him cracked just enough for her to see through. She sat beside him without speaking. The fire popped and settled. Wind pressed against the cabin walls, and in that silence something shifted between them, something that could never shift back. On the seventh morning, Leonard tried to bake bread. The result was a blackened brick that Colt picked up off the table and rapped against the wooden surface, producing a sound like a mallet striking stone. "I think we can use this to patch the barn roof," he said gravely. "Or maybe as an anchor for the fishing boat we don't have." All four of them laughed. Eleanor laughed until tears ran down her cheeks, laughed harder than she had in years. Maybe harder than she had ever laughed, and the sound of her own laughter startled her the way a bird startled from cover. Sometimes startles even itself. On the eighth night, they gathered around the fire and traded stories. Bridger spoke of the Ute campaign, the cold on those high plateaus, men crying in the dark and pretending they hadn't when morning came. The weight of lives lost because he didn't have the tools, the knowledge, the time to save them. Colt spoke of prison, 6 months in a cell in Silver Creek where the walls closed in and the silence was its own kind of violence. He would do it again, he said, without hesitation. And Silas, who had been silent through both his brothers' accounts, finally spoke. "I was engaged once. Her name was Lenora." The room went still. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. He told it simply, without drama, without the self-pitying embellishment that lesser men apply to their wounds. Lenora Prescott, 26 years old, best horsewoman in the territory. They were 2 months from the wedding when her horse spooked in the corral on a clear October afternoon. Threw her. She landed wrong. Her neck broke. By the time Silas rode back from town with flour and nails and a bolt of blue fabric, she'd asked him to pick up for her wedding dress as she had been dead for 3 hours. "I wasn't there." His voice was flat, controlled. But Eleanor could hear the fracture lines running beneath the surface. "I should have been there. If I'd stayed home that day, instead of riding to town for supplies that could have waited a week, I'd have been in the corral. I'd have seen the horse acting strange. I'd have pulled her off before anything happened." "You couldn't have known," Eleanor said. "No, but I could have been there. And I wasn't. And that is something I will carry for the rest of my life." Eleanor understood then. Understood why Silas held everything so tight, why his control was absolute, his vigilance constant, his attention to every detail of the world around him almost obsessive. He had failed to protect someone he loved, and the failure had rewritten the architecture of his soul. Every locked gate, every checked cinch strap, every insistence that Eleanor stay off her ankle was not just caution. It was penance, an ongoing, endless attempt to ensure that what happened to Lenora would never happen to anyone else in his care. On the ninth day, Eleanor stood on the porch at sunset and watched the mountains turn colors she had no names for. Gold bleeding into rose, bleeding into purple, bleeding into the deep final blue of approaching night. The beauty of it ached in her chest. She did not hear Silas come up behind her, did not know he was there until she felt his presence, a shift in the quality of the air. They stood side by side for a long time without speaking. The sky darkened. Stars appeared, more stars than Eleanor had known existed, scattered across the heavens in numbers that made her dizzy. Then Silas's hand moved. Slowly, his fingers rough with calluses, gentle with intention, touched her chin and tilted her face up toward his. "I'm going to kiss you now," he said. His voice was low and rough and carried the weight of something that had been building for 9 days, or maybe for 6 years, or maybe for his entire life. "If you don't want that, say so." Eleanor said nothing. She lifted her face, closed the distance between them. The kiss was gentle. His lips were warm against hers despite the cold air, and she could feel the rasp of his stubble against her chin, could taste coffee and wood smoke, could feel the tension in his jaw as he held himself in check, giving her only what she was ready to receive and not one fraction more. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. And when he pulled away, Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, a knot so old and so familiar that she had mistaken it for part of her own anatomy. A knot made of years of being told she was not enough, not wanted, not worth the space she occupied. That knot in the space of one gentle kiss on a Colorado porch came undone. "This place wasn't home," Silas said quietly, looking out at the ranch he had built with his brothers, the land he had worked for a decade, the mountains that had been his whole world for as long as he could remember. "Not until you're home now." The words settled over Eleanor like a quilt pulled up against the cold. Simple, warm, true. She did not know yet how that home would be tested. Did not know that 700 miles east, a man with cold eyes was boarding a train. Did not know that the past she had fled was not content to stay in Boston. Did not know that the hardest winter was still ahead and it would test all four of them in ways none of them expected. But standing on that porch with the taste of Silas Calloway's kiss still on her lips and the stars of Colorado spread above her, like a promise, Eleanor Rose Whitfield felt something she had not felt in 22 years of living. She felt like she belonged. And that feeling, fragile as new ice and just as dangerous, was worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth everything. What came next would require all of that fight, and more. Because the storm building on the horizon was not made of snow. It was made of something far more dangerous, and it was coming fast. The morning after their first kiss, Eleanor woke to find the bed half empty. Silas's side was cold, which meant he had been up for hours. Bridger's coat hung on the back of the chair where he always left it when he checked on her during the night, a habit she had grown to expect, and if she was honest, to depend on. Colt's boots were gone from the hallway, which meant all three brothers were already working. She dressed in clothes that had become familiar over 11 days. Bridger's shirt rolled at the sleeves. A pair of trousers Colt had found somewhere that almost fit if she cinched the belt tight enough. Sturdy boots that Silas had produced without explanation, sized for a woman barely worn. And Eleanor did not ask whose they had been because she already knew, and asking would have meant speaking Lenore's name on a morning that felt too fragile for ghosts. She descended the stairs carefully, her ankles still tender but functional, and walked into chaos. A man stood in the center of the main room, tall, lean, wearing city clothes so obviously unsuited to the Colorado winter that he might as well have been wearing a sign that said Boston. His boots were polished leather, soaked through and ruined by snow. His overcoat was fine wool expensive and entirely inadequate. And his face, when it turned toward Eleanor as she came down the stairs, wore an expression she recognized from a lifetime of navigating her father's world. The look of a man who considers himself superior to everyone in the room and does not bother to hide it. Well, well, his accent was pure Beacon Hill. Clipped, precise dripping with the particular breed of condescension that Boston's upper class had perfected over 200 years of practice, if it isn't the runaway bride. Eleanor's blood went cold. The warmth she had been building, the fragile architecture of safety and belonging she had been constructing over 11 days, cracked like river ice under sudden weight. "Who are you, Edmund Garrett?" The man pulled a badge from inside his coat and held it up with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having his credentials taken seriously. "Private investigator, hired by your father and Lord Pembroke to retrieve stolen property." He let his eyes travel over her top to bottom with the kind of assessment that reduced a person to an object. "That would be you, Miss Whitfield, and the $500 you took when you left." 500, the number hit her like a fist. She had taken 200, exactly 200. She had counted it 3 times. Her father had inflated the amount by more than double, turning a desperate act of survival into a federal crime. Silas moved before Eleanor fully registered what was happening. One moment he was standing by the fireplace, the next he was between her and Garrett, a wall of muscle and controlled fury that blocked the investigator's view of her completely. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He simply occupied the space between Eleanor and danger with the absolute certainty of a man who has decided that nothing will get past him. "She's not going anywhere." Garrett's smile was thin as a blade. "I'm afraid that's not your decision, Mr. Calloway. Miss Whitfield is wanted for theft in Massachusetts. I have the authority to return her to Boston to face charges." "Theft." Eleanor's voice shook despite her efforts to control it. She stepped to Silas's side, refusing to hide behind him, even though every instinct screamed at her to let his body remain between her and this man from her past. "That money was my inheritance from my mother. Jewelry she left me. It was mine by right. Your father disputes that claim." Garrett pulled papers from inside his coat, unfolding them with deliberate slowness. "He's filed a complaint. Theft of $500, not 200. Seems there's some discrepancy in the accounting. Because he's lying." Eleanor felt the old anger rising, the fury that her father could reach across 1,000 miles of wilderness and still find ways to hurt her. I took exactly $200. He inflated the amount to make it a federal matter, to ensure pursuit across state lines. Perhaps. Garrett's shrug was the most dismissive gesture Eleanor had ever witnessed, and she had witnessed many in Boston's drawing rooms. But that's for the courts to decide. You're coming back to Boston, Miss Whitfield. Your father has given me authorization to use whatever means necessary to ensure your return. Bridger appeared from the hallway, moving to flank Garrett's left side. His face had gone still in a way Eleanor had not seen before the warmth stripped away to reveal something harder underneath. Something that reminded her he had served in the military, had watched men die, had made decisions under fire that most people would never be asked to make. Colt materialized from the kitchen doorway, taking the right flank. His green eyes had gone flat and cold. The mischief and humor burned away like fog in morning sun. Every muscle in his body was coiled ready, and for the first time Eleanor understood viscerally that Colt Calloway was a dangerous man. Not because he was cruel, but because he was loyal, and loyal men with hot tempers and physical gifts were the most dangerous creatures on earth when someone they cared about was threatened. The four of them stood there, Garrett in the center surrounded, three brothers arranged around him like points of a triangle, and Eleanor beside Silas refusing to retreat. Then Silas spoke, and his words changed everything. "She's my wife." Silence crashed through the room like a dropped anvil. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to pause, the logs settling without their usual pop and crackle. Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me, Eleanor is my wife." Silas's voice was level as a carpenter's tool. Not a tremor, not a waver, not a single crack in the surface for doubt to find purchase. "We were married by the county judge the day she arrived. She's no longer Eleanor Whitfield. She's Eleanor Calloway, which means your warrant name's a woman who doesn't exist and you have no authority over my wife. That's impossible." Garrett's composure flickered just for a moment, just enough for Eleanor to see the uncertainty underneath. "You met 11 days ago. We've been corresponding for weeks. The wedding was planned for her arrival. We simply moved the timeline up due to weather." Silas pulled Eleanor against his side, his arm around her waist, and the gesture was possessive and protective in equal measure. "Everything is legal. Everything is proper. Everything is binding. I'll need to see the marriage certificate, being filed with the county this week." Bridger's voice was silk stretched over steel. "Won't be official for a few days, but I can show you the minister's receipt if you'd like. Judge Morrison performs all the marriages in this district. You're welcome to ride down to Elk Ridge and ask him yourself." Eleanor stood within the circle of Silas's arm and felt her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough to crack them. This was a lie, all of it. They were not married. There had been no ceremony, no judge, no legal documents of any kind. Silas Calloway was fabricating an entire marriage out of thin air, staking his freedom and his reputation on a fiction, committing what might well be federal fraud, all to protect a woman he had known for 11 days. And his brothers were backing him without hesitation. Building the lie together the way they built everything together, each one adding his piece, each one steady, each one absolutely committed. "Even if this marriage is real," Garrett said, and Eleanor could hear him recalculating, adjusting, searching for leverage, "the theft charges still stand. She can be prosecuted as a married woman just as easily as an unmarried one." "Can she?" Silas's voice dropped into a register that Eleanor felt in her bones. "Because I was under the impression that under Colorado territorial law, a married woman's property becomes her husband's upon the exchange of vows, which means any money Eleanor brought into this marriage became mine the moment we said I do. So if anyone stole anything, Mr. Garrett, it was me, and I'm standing right here. You want to arrest someone? Go ahead. Arrest me. See how that works out for you." The legal reasoning was beyond Eleanor's immediate analysis, but she saw its effect on Garrett's face. Saw the color drain, saw the man from Boston realize that he was not dealing with uneducated mountain folk who could be bullied with badges and legal jargon. He was dealing with men who understood the ground they stood on, literally and figuratively, and who were not going to give an inch. "This isn't over." Garrett's voice had lost its smooth confidence. "I'll be reporting this to my employers. If there is fraud involved here, and I believe there is, you will all face charges. You do that." Silas's arm tightened around Eleanor. "In the meantime, my wife and I would appreciate it if you'd leave our property. Storm's clearing. You should be able to make it back to Elk Ridge by nightfall if you leave now. I'd recommend moving quickly." Weather turns fast in these mountains, and I'd hate for you to get caught in something you're not equipped to survive. Garrett looked between the four of them. Three large men who knew every rock and ridge and frozen creek crossing of this territory against one city investigator whose fine leather boots were already falling apart. The mathematics were not favorable. I'll be back, he promised, with federal marshals if necessary. Looking forward to it. Colt's grin was all teeth and no warmth. Safe travels, Mr. Garrett. Garrett stared at Eleanor one final time. You're making a mistake, he said. Whatever these men have promised you, it won't last. Men like this don't keep promises. You'll regret running. Eleanor met his gaze and held it. Held it the way she had learned to hold the gazes of men who thought they owned her, with a steadiness that came not from confidence but from the absolute refusal to look away. I already have plenty of regrets, Mr. Garrett, but coming here is not one of them. And I would rather face whatever comes next on this mountain with these men than spend another day in the world you came from, a world that puts a price on a woman's head and calls it justice. Garrett left. They heard his horse on the frozen ground, heard the hoofbeats fade to silence, and then the four of them stood in the quiet of the ranch house while the weight of what had just happened settled over them like snowfall. Silas's arm was still around Eleanor's waist. She could feel his heart beating through the contact faster than his calm exterior would suggest. The adrenaline was still in him. She could feel it in the tension of his muscles, in the slight tremor in the hand that rested on her hip. He had lied for her, risked everything for her, called her his wife in front of a federal investigator, and dared the man to challenge it. Thank you, she whispered. All of you, for the lie, for the protection, for giving me a chance. Silas turned her to face him. His hands found her shoulders and his eyes found hers, and what she saw in them was not triumph or satisfaction. It was urgency. We didn't lie about the important part, Eleanor. You do need to marry me. Today. Right now, before Garrett comes back with those marshals. The words hung in the air between them. You mean actually marry? She heard her own voice from a great distance. Legally, truly, unless you'd rather go back to Boston. Bridger stepped closer, his voice gentle in the way it always was when the situation was anything but gentle. Once you're legally married, your father loses his claim. The theft charges become a property dispute between spouses, which is a civil matter, not criminal. Pembroke loses his purchase of bride, and we gain the wife we wanted. Colt moved to her other side. We know you're brave. We know you're smart. We know you need us as much as we need you. That's a better foundation than most marriages start with, Eleanor. Eleanor thought about Pembroke, about liver-spotted hands and the smell of decay, about four women who had gone into that marriage alive and come out in coffins. Then she thought about Silas chopping wood in the dawn light, about Bridger bringing her breakfast and checking on her through the night, about Colt teaching her to swing an axe and laughing with her when she failed and cheering when she succeeded. She thought about a kiss on a porch at sunset and a voice saying this place wasn't home until you. It was not love. Not yet. Not the way poets wrote about it or preachers spoke about it or old women described it with faraway eyes and soft voices. But it was the beginning of something. A seed planted in frozen ground waiting for spring. Yes, the word came out clear and strong, surprising her with its own certainty. I'll marry you today, right now, all three of you in whatever way that means. Silas's smile was sudden and rare, and it transformed the granite of his face into something that was not quite beautiful, but was something better than beautiful, something real and warm and alive. Then let's get you ready, Mrs. Calloway. We have a wedding to arrange. The county judge, a small, weathered man named Morrison, who looked like he had been carved from the same wood as the mountains, arrived 3 hours later. Silas had ridden to Elk Ridge and back through breaking weather to fetch him, and the old judge settled into a chair by the fire with the unhurried calm of a man who had performed enough frontier weddings to be surprised by nothing. Bit irregular, Morrison observed his bright eyes moving between the four of them. Young lady arrives yesterday, getting married today. Some might call that hasty. Some might call it necessary, Silas said. His voice was respectful but firm. My wife and I have been corresponding for weeks. The wedding was always planned for her arrival. Circumstances require that we formalize things now rather than wait. Morrison's gaze settled on Eleanor, stayed there for a long moment while he studied her with the quiet thoroughness of a man whose job required him to distinguish between truth and its many counterfeits. Young lady, do you want to marry this man? Are you being coerced in any way? Eleanor thought about coercion, thought about her father's hand on a contract, thought about Pembroke's hand on hers, thought about all the ways a woman could be forced into a life she didn't choose by men who believed they had the right. And then she thought about Silas, about the question in his eyes when he reached for her, about the way he always gave her the chance to say no. I want this, she said, and her voice did not waver. I choose this. I choose him. Morrison nodded slowly. Then let's get on with it. You have witnesses. Bridger and Colt stepped forward, flanking Eleanor like sentinels. We witness, they said, together, as they did everything. The ceremony was brief. Morrison spoke the words from memory, his voice carrying a weight that came from having joined hundreds of lives across decades of frontier service. Silas's responses were steady as bedrock. Eleanor's voice trembled only once when she promised to love and honor, and the tremble was not from doubt, but from the sheer overwhelming enormity of what she was doing. The ring Silas placed on her finger was simple gold, warm from being carried in his pocket against his body. It had belonged to his mother, Bridger whispered to her later. Kept safe all these years, waiting for the right woman. It was slightly loose on Eleanor's slender finger, but she would grow into it, just as she would grow into this life, this family, this impossible, improbable, entirely unprecedented love. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you husband and wife. Morrison closed his book with a quiet finality. You may kiss your bride. Silas cupped Eleanor's face in both hands. His thumbs traced her cheekbones, that gesture that had become theirs, that small, repeating act of tenderness that said more than any words. His eyes asked a question. She answered by rising on her toes. The kiss was soft, brief, a promise sealed with the lightest possible pressure. But it carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment, the 1,000-mile train ride, the frozen platform, the blizzard, the three men who had offered her a life she never imagined, and the woman brave enough to accept it. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Calloway. Morrison filed the papers. Everything legal, everything binding. Eleanor Rose Whitfield ceased to exist on paper, and in her place stood Eleanor Rose Calloway, wife to one man by law, bound to three by choice. The judge left with payment in his pocket and a knowing look on his weathered face. Told them the documents would be official within the week. Congratulated them. Wished them well. And then they were alone. That night, Silas whispered in the darkness as they lay in the big bed with Bridgers on one side and Colt at the foot. Nothing had changed except everything tonight we celebrate. Nothing more than that. You've been through enough. Tomorrow then, Eleanor said. What happens tomorrow? Tomorrow we start learning what it means to be a family. All four of us. Eleanor closed her eyes, listened to 3 heartbeats settling into rhythm around her, and felt for the first time in memory completely safe. You're home now, right where you're supposed to be. The words followed her into sleep like a lantern carried into darkness. 3 days after the wedding, the household shattered. It started with whispers. Eleanor was in the library, a book open on her lap that she had not been reading for the better part of an hour, when voices carried down the hallway from the bedroom Silas sometimes used alone. Voices raised in anger in a house where anger was usually kept on a short leash and only released in controlled, purposeful bursts. Colt and Silas. And they were not just arguing, they were fighting the way brothers fight, with the savage intimacy of men who know exactly where each other's wounds are and exactly how to press on them. You're holding back. Colt's voice carried through wood and stone, stripped of its usual humor, raw with frustration. You barely look at her. You flinch when she touches you. You pull away every time something real starts to happen between you. If you can't commit to this, Silas, then let her go. Or at the very least, step aside and let Bridge and me take care of her the way she deserves. Silence. Then Silas, and his voice was terrible in its control and the way it held everything inside like a dam holding back a flood. You don't know what you're asking me. Every time I look at her, Colt, every single time I see Lenora. I see her in that corral. I see the horse rearing. I see her on the ground with her neck at that angle. And every time Eleanor rides out, every time she walks down those stairs, every time she does anything that puts her in the path of anything that could hurt her, I think about it happening again. about coming home to find her broken, about being too late. Again, she is not Lenora. Colt's voice cracked, and underneath the anger, Eleanor heard something else. Desperation, pain, the agony of watching his brother drown and not being able to reach him. Eleanor is alive. She's here. She's waiting for you to stop being afraid long enough to love her. And if you push her away, she'll leave. And we all lose her. All three of us. Is that what you want? A sound that might have been a fist hitting a wall, might have been something breaking. Then Bridger's voice, calm and steady as always, cutting through the fury with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Enough, both of you. Enough. Eleanor stood in the hallway with her hand over her mouth and her heart hammering. She had not meant to eavesdrop, had not sought this out. But the ranch house was wood and stone, and sound traveled through it like water through a riverbed, following the path of least resistance. She should have been frightened, should have heard two men arguing about her, and felt the familiar cold of being reduced to an object, a thing to be claimed or abandoned at someone else's convenience. Instead, she felt something unexpected, something that unfurled in her chest like a flag catching wind. They cared about her, all three of them, enough to argue, enough to fight, enough to risk the bond between brothers over the question of how best to love her. This was real. This was not performance or obligation or the kind of care that evaporates under pressure. This was messy and painful and complicated and absolutely undeniably real. The next morning, Eleanor found Silas in the barn before dawn. He was sitting on a hay bale with his back against the wall and his hands hanging between his knees, and he looked older than his 33 years. Older and tireder and haunted by something that no amount of hard work or mountain air could exorcise. She sat beside him, did not ask permission, did not wait for an invitation, simply sat close enough that their shoulders touched and spoke. I heard you last night, about Lenora, about being afraid. Silas went rigid, the muscles in his jaw clenched hard enough that Eleanor could see the tendons stand out against his neck. His hands, those broad, scarred, careful hands, closed into fists on his knees. I'm not her, Silas. Eleanor kept her voice steady, though what she was saying required more courage than anything she had done since boarding that train in Boston. I can't promise I won't get hurt. Nobody can promise that, not on a mountain, not in a city, not anywhere on this earth. But I can promise you I won't disappear without a fight. I've already crossed half a continent to be here. I survived my father in Pembroke in a blizzard, in a wagon crash, in Edmund Garrett. I'm harder to kill than you think. She paused, waited for the words to settle, and I refuse to live with a man who is too afraid to love me. I've spent 22 years being treated like something fragile that might break. I am not fragile, Silas. I am not Lenora. And you have to stop seeing her every time you look at me, because I deserve to be seen for who I am, not who you lost. Silas did not move for a long time. The barn was quiet around them, just the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls and the creak of wood settling against cold. Then his hand unclenched, reached for hers, found it, and held on with a grip that trembled. It does count, he said. His voice was rough, cracked, stripped of every layer of control and protection until there was nothing left but the raw truth underneath. Everything you did to get here, everything you are. It counts, Eleanor. It counts more than I know how to tell you. She laced her fingers through his, squeezed, held on. But there was more to discover, and what Eleanor found next would test them all. It happened later that same day. She was in the office reviewing old contracts when a leather folder slipped from behind a stack of ledgers on the top shelf. It hit the floor and papers scattered, and among them Eleanor saw a letter that stopped her breath. It was addressed to Silas, from the sheriff of Elk Ridge, dated 6 years earlier. The handwriting was cramped and official. Re-death of Miss Lenora Ann Prescott. Coroner's report enclosed. Cause of death, broken neck, consistent with writing, accident. Case closed. However, testimony from farmhand Jonas Webb contradicts the initial finding. Webb states he observed an unfamiliar individual near the deceased's horse approximately 30 minutes before the incident. Individual described as tall, lean-build, city clothing, cold demeanor. The letter continued, but the bottom third had been torn away. Deliberately, someone had removed the rest of the sheriff's words with enough force to leave ragged edges on the paper. Eleanor's hands were shaking when she brought the letter to Bridger that afternoon. She found him in the barn stitching a gash on a horse's foreleg with the calm concentration that was his hallmark. Who was Jonas Webb? Bridger's hands stopped moving. The color left his face slowly like water draining from a basin, and what remained was something Eleanor had not seen in him before. Fear. Where did you find that in the office? Behind the ledgers. Who was he? Bridger set down the needle, wiped his hands on a rag, and told her Jonas Webb was a farmhand. Worked on the ranch for 2 seasons back when Lenore was alive. After her death, he went to the sheriff and said he'd seen someone near Lenora's horse that afternoon. Someone who shouldn't have been there, a stranger. Tall, thin, city clothes, cold eyes. Jonas said the man was doing something near the horse's stall, but he couldn't see what from where he was standing. 30 minutes later, the horse spooked and Lenore was dead. And the sheriff investigated. Bridger's laugh was bitter. The sheriff took Jonas's statement and filed it. There was no physical evidence. No one else saw the stranger. And Jonas was a drifter, a seasonal worker with no permanent address and no standing in the community. His word against the coroner's report didn't carry much weight. What happened to Jonas? He disappeared. 2 weeks after giving his statement, he was gone. Left in the night without collecting his final wages. Nobody knew where he went. Nobody looked very hard for him. Eleanor felt cold spreading through her body, a different kind of cold from the Colorado winter. Colder and deeper and coming from inside rather than out. Silas knows about this. Silas has spent 6 years trying to find Jonas Webb, trying to prove that what happened to Lenora was not an accident. It's consumed him, Eleanor. It's part of why he holds everything so tight, part of why the control matters so much. Because if someone murdered the woman he loved and he couldn't prevent it and couldn't prove it and couldn't bring anyone to justice for it, then what good is control? What good is anything? Eleanor looked at the torn letter in her hands, looked at the description of the stranger. Tall, lean, city clothes, cold eyes. Bridge, she said slowly, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears. The man Jonas described. Does that description remind you of anyone? Bridger stared at her. She watched, understanding dawn in his brown eyes, watched it arrive like sunrise, gradual, and then all at once, and impossible to look away from. Garrett, he breathed. My God. Edmund Garrett. That night, Eleanor brought the letter to Silas, watched his face go through stone to something beyond stone, something geological, something formed under pressures that would crush ordinary men. He read it twice, though she suspected he had read it many times before, had carried its contents in his memory like a splinter buried too deep to remove. I should have told you about this, he said. Tell me now. He told her. Everything Bridger had said and more. The way Jonas's description had haunted him for 6 years. The investigation that went nowhere. The leads that dried up. The gradual grinding acceptance that he might never know what really happened to Lenora. And then he told her the thing that changed the entire landscape of their situation. The man Jonas described, Silas said, and his voice was quiet the way the center of a storm is quiet, tall, lean city clothes, cold eyes. I've been carrying that description in my head for 6 years, Eleanor. And the moment Edmund Garrett walked into this house, I knew. You think Garrett killed Lenora? I think there is a possibility that the man your father hired to find you is the same man who was near Lenora's horse the day she died. I can't prove it. Not yet. But the coincidence is too precise to ignore. The cold inside Eleanor turned to ice. The man hunting her might be a murderer. The man her father had sent across 1,000 miles to drag her back to Boston might have blood on his hands that had nothing to do with her. But that discovery, devastating as it was, would have to wait. Because the mountain had its own crisis in store, and it came not from Boston, but from the sky. The blizzard hit 3 days later, and it was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced. She had been through the storm on her first night, the one that had dumped snow and dropped temperatures and made the 20-mile wagon ride an exercise in survival. But that storm had been a rehearsal. This was the performance. The temperature fell to 30 below zero. Wind drove snow horizontally hard enough to draw blood from exposed skin. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the ranch house walls ceased to exist, replaced by a howling white void that pressed against every window and door as if trying to get inside. Silas organized them with military precision. He assigned shifts to keep the fires burning around the clock 3 hours on 9 hours off, rotating through the night so that at least one person was always awake, always feeding wood to the fireplaces that were the only barrier between them and a cold that would kill in hours. He showed Eleanor how to pack snow around the foundation of the house, packing it tight to create insulation against the wind. He explained why they melted snow for water in pots, rather than eating it directly because ingesting frozen water would lower the body's core temperature and accelerate hypothermia. A lesson he had learned in the Ute campaign when soldiers who ate snow died faster than soldiers who went thirsty. Colt made the rounds of the outbuildings twice a day, fighting through drifts that reached his chest to check on the horses and livestock. He came back each time coated in white, his eyebrows frozen, his face raw, and each time he thawed by the fire without complaint before going out again. Bridger monitored the animal's health from the barn, which was connected to the main house by a covered walkway that Silas had built years ago for exactly this purpose. The horses were frightened by the wind. The cattle huddled together in the lower pasture shelter. Everything alive on this mountain was fighting the same battle. Survival against a force that did not care whether they lived or died. On the second night of the blizzard, Copper got sick. Eleanor heard the horse's labored breathing from the hallway that connected to the barn, a wet, rattling sound that she recognized instinctively as dangerous even before Bridger confirmed it. Pneumonia, his face was grim. She needs medicine. Tincture of camphor and pine tar. I've got it in the supply shed. The supply shed was 200 yards from the house. 200 yards through a blizzard that had already buried the fences and was working on the first floor windows. 200 yards and 30 below zero, with wind strong enough to knock a man off his feet. I'll go in the morning when the wind drops, Silas said. Morning might be too late for the horse, Bridger replied quietly. Silas looked at him. Something passed between the brothers that Eleanor could not read, some calculation of risk and necessity that spoke of years of shared decisions in unforgiving conditions. Before that calculation could resolve, Bridger was gone. He did not announce his departure, did not ask permission or wait for consensus. He simply pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible, and went out the side door into the howling dark. Eleanor did not realize what had happened until Colt came in from his evening check and said, "Where's Bridge?" And the answer that formed in the silence between them was worse than any words could have been. They found him 20 minutes later. Colt spotted him through the kitchen window, a dark shape in the snow, motionless. Not 200 yards from the house. Not at the supply shed. Halfway between, face down in a drift, the medicine bag clutched in one hand. Colt went out, dragged his brother back through snow that fought him for every inch, got him through the door and onto the floor in front of the fireplace. Bridger was conscious, but barely. His eyes were open, and they were wrong unfocused, tracking things that were not in the room. His skin was white, his lips were blue, and there was blood in the snow on his face, a thin line running from his nose where he had hit the frozen ground. Eleanor knelt beside him. She did not think about what to do. She simply did it, stripped off his wet coat, his frozen gloves, wrapped him in every blanket within reach, began working his hands between hers, massaging circulation back into fingers that had gone stiff and waxy. Bridge. She kept her voice calm, level. The voice of a woman who had learned over 11 days on this mountain that panic was a luxury no one could afford. Bridge, look at me. Look at my eyes. Stay with me. His eyes focused, found hers. And in them, Eleanor saw confusion, disorientation, the look of a man who has lost time and does not know where it went. The medicine, he slurred. Did I make it? You made it. Eleanor held up the bag that Colt had pried from his frozen grip. Copper's going to be fine. But you, Bridge, what happened out there? Bridger closed his eyes. And when he opened them, the confusion had been replaced by something worse. Resignation. It happens sometimes. His voice was thin. Since the campaign, since '79, I lose time, a few seconds, sometimes longer. Everything goes dark and then I'm somewhere else. Somewhere I don't remember going. I fell. Must have lost consciousness on the way back. Silas was on his knees beside his brother. His face held an expression Eleanor had never seen on it before. Naked terror, the kind that strips away every defense and leaves nothing but the raw, vulnerable core of a man confronting his deepest fear. How long, Bridge? His voice cracked on the name. How long has this been happening? Years. Bridger did not look away from his brother's eyes. Since the war, the surgeon said it was the concussion. The one from the Meeker fight when the supply wagon overturned. It comes and goes. Sometimes months pass between episodes. Sometimes they come in clusters. Years. Colt's voice was barely a whisper. He was kneeling on Bridger's other side, his hand gripping his brother's shoulder. You've been dealing with this for years, alone without telling us. I didn't want to be a burden. Bridger's voice broke on the word. Didn't want you to think I couldn't pull my weight, couldn't do my share, couldn't be trusted to work alone or ride alone or take care of the animals or do any of the 100 things that need doing on this ranch every single day. I didn't want to be the one you had to worry about, the one you had to watch, the weak link. The room was silent except for the fire and the wind and the sound of Bridger Calloway finally telling the truth about the weight he had been carrying alone for years. Eleanor held his hand and felt him shaking not from cold, but from the enormity of the secret he had finally released. You're an idiot, Colt said. His voice was thick. His green eyes were bright with moisture he would deny to his dying day. A brave, stubborn, impossible idiot. You're our brother. You could lose both your legs and we'd still need you, still want you, still couldn't run this place without you. No more secrets, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was not. She tightened her grip on Bridger's hand and looked at Silas and then at Colt and then back at Bridger, making sure all three of them heard what she was saying and understood that she meant every word. We agreed. No secrets between us. That was the rule. And it applies to everyone in this family, including you, Bridge, especially you. Something broke open in that room, not the kind of breaking that destroys, but the kind that allows. The kind that happens when a seed cracks its shell or a chick cracks its egg or a river breaks through a dam it has been pressing against for years. Something was released that had been held too long, and in its release there was pain, but also relief, and in the relief there was something very close to grace. The four of them held each other beside the fire while the blizzard raged outside, held on through the cold and the fear and the awful, wonderful honesty of four flawed people choosing to be a family, not because it was easy or conventional or anything the world would approve of, but because it was right, because they needed each other, because together they were something they could never be alone. I need you to understand something, Eleanor said into the warmth of that embrace. All three of you. I didn't stay on this mountain because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because this is where I'm supposed to be. I choose you, all of you, not because I'm desperate, not because I'm trapped, because you're home. You are my home, and I'd walk through 100 blizzards to find you again. Silas's arms tightened around her, his face was buried in her hair, and his shoulders were shaking. And Eleanor understood that the man who had not cried since Lenora's death, who had locked his grief behind 6 years of iron control, was finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of what it meant to love someone again. I didn't expect you, he said. His voice was wrecked. But I'm not letting you go. Stronger together than apart. Bridger's hand found Eleanor's. Squeezed. Built this with our own hands. Colt's voice was rough, but his eyes were clear. All four of us now. The blizzard lasted another day. And when it finally broke, when the wind died and the sun emerged and the world outside the cabin walls was reborn in blinding white, the four people inside that house were not the same ones who had gone into the storm. They were a family. But the test was not over. Garrett came back on a clear February morning with the sun turning the snow fields into a landscape of diamonds. He did not come alone. Beside him rode a man in a federal marshal's uniform, older, harder, with the bearing of someone who took his authority seriously. 2 deputies flanked them, 4 riders coming up the road. Eleanor saw them first from the kitchen window, and for one terrible moment all the old fear came rushing back, the fear of Boston, of her father, of Pembroke, of being dragged back to a life that would kill her. Then Silas's hand found the small of her back, warm, steady, present. We'll get through this, he said quietly. Harder things have been survived. Marshal Thomas Hackett was not Edmund Garrett. That much was clear within the first 5 minutes. Where Garrett was all performance and presumption, Hackett was substance. He entered the ranch house and looked around with eyes that missed nothing, assessed everything, and jumped to no conclusions. Mr. Calloway, his voice was measured. I have a warrant for the arrest of Eleanor Whitfield on charges of theft, $500 federal jurisdiction. I'm also investigating a claim of marriage fraud. I'd like to see the documentation and speak to all parties involved. Eleanor did not hide behind Silas, did not retreat to the stairs or the bedroom or the safety of distance. She stepped forward, stood beside her husband, and spoke. Marshall, I need to tell you three things. Hackett listened. His eyes stayed on hers. First, I took $200, not $500. The money came from selling jewelry that my mother left me in a hat box in the attic of my father's house. It was my inheritance, hidden deliberately from my father because my mother knew what kind of man he would become. My father inflated the amount to $500 to ensure federal jurisdiction. He is a lying marshal. And if you contact the pawnbroker on Fleet Street in Boston's South End, he will confirm the amount I received. Second, my father arranged to sell me, and I use that word, deliberately sell me to Lord Reginald Pembroke of London to settle a $50,000 debt. Lord Pembroke is 68 years old. He has had 4 previous wives. All 4 died within 5 years of their marriage. The official cause of death in each case was listed as natural causes or weak constitution. The unofficial cause, which is whispered about in every drawing room in Boston, is cruelty. My father knew this when he signed the contract. He sold his daughter to a man he knew would destroy her, and he did it to save his own reputation. Third, my marriage to Silas Calloway is real. It is legal. It was performed by Judge Morrison of Elk Ridge and witnessed by 2 upstanding citizens of this territory. I was not coerced. I was not deceived. I stood before a judge and chose this man in this life of my own free will. I am Eleanor Calloway, and I am not going back to Boston. Hackett's expression did not change during any of this. He listened. He watched. He processed. Then Silas played his final card. Marshall, before you make any decisions, I'd like you to look at something. He produced the torn letter from the sheriff, the one about Lenora, the one that described a stranger near her horse before it spooked. He also produced a letter Eleanor had helped him draft over the past 3 days, addressed to the sheriff's office in Denver, requesting that the investigation into Lenora Prescott's death be reopened. 6 years ago, a woman I loved was killed. The only witness described a man matching Mr. Garrett's exact description at the scene. I'm not accusing him. I'm asking for an investigation that was never properly conducted. And I would appreciate it if the federal marshal's office could assist. Garrett, who had been standing near the door with his arms crossed and his expression smug, went white. This is absurd. His voice lost its polish, the Beacon Hill smoothness cracking to reveal something sharper and less pleasant underneath. I have never been to Colorado before last month. This is a fabrication, a desperate attempt to distract from the real matter at hand. Then you won't mind if the marshal checks your travel records, Colt said. His voice was pleasant. His eyes were not. Hackett looked at the letter, looked at Garrett, looked at the marriage certificate that Morrison had filed legal and proper, looked at Eleanor standing beside her husband with her chin raised and her shoulders straight and her eyes clear, and made his decision. Mrs. Calloway, the theft charge will be reduced to $200 based on your testimony and pending verification with the pawnbroker in Boston. At that amount, this becomes a state matter, not federal. I will recommend the charge be handled locally. As for the marriage, he glanced at the certificate. I see nothing here that suggests fraud. Everything appears to be in order. He turned to Garrett. Mr. Garrett, I'd like you to remain in Elk Ridge while I verify some things. Your description matches details in an open investigation, and I take cold cases seriously. Garrett's composure shattered. You stupid girl. He wheeled on Eleanor, the mask of civilized professionalism falling away, to reveal the thing that had been hiding behind it all along. Your father should have beaten the defiance out of you years ago. Pembroke would have fixed that. He always fixes his wives. None of them lasted long enough to cause problems. The room went absolutely still. Everyone in that room heard what Garrett had just said, heard the casual familiarity with which he spoke about Pembroke's treatment of his wives, heard the word fixes and understood exactly what it meant. Heard none of them lasted and understood that Garrett had always known what Pembroke did to the women he married, and did not care. Colt moved before anyone else could react. His hand closed on Garrett's collar and lifted the man 6 inches off the ground with one arm. The veins in Colt's forearm stood out like ropes. His green eyes blazed with a fire that was real and dangerous and barely contained by the fragile leash of self-control. Bridger pulled Colt back. Silas stepped in front of Eleanor. A wall between her and the man from Boston. Hackett's voice cut through the tension like an axe through dry wood. "Mr. Garrett, you'll be spending tonight in the Elk Ridge jail while I send some telegrams. I suggest you cooperate. The situation you've described regarding Lord Pembroke's wives is something I intend to include in my report." Garrett was escorted out. His horse carried him down the road flanked by deputies, and Eleanor watched from the window until he disappeared around the bend, a figure growing smaller against the snow diminishing, becoming nothing. But the crisis was not over. Because after Garrett was gone, after the marshals rode away, Hackett turned back to Eleanor with one last piece of information. "Mrs. Calloway, during my investigation, I discovered that the advertisement your husband placed for a mail-order bride was published in 6 different newspapers across 4 states, and you were not the first respondent. 3 other women arrived at Elk Ridge before you. None of them stayed longer than 2 weeks." The warmth drained from Eleanor's body. She turned to Silas. "You didn't tell me there were others." Silas's face held the expression of a man watching something precious slip through his fingers. "They weren't you, Eleanor. That's not the point." Her voice was steady, but something inside her was crumbling. "You said no secrets. That was your rule, Silas, and you broke it." She went upstairs, closed the door to the bedroom they shared, and for the first time since arriving on this mountain, she turned the lock. The click was small. The silence that followed was enormous. She lay in the dark and listened to 3 men moving quietly downstairs. Not arguing, not talking, just existing in the terrible space created by a broken promise. She thought about leaving, thought about packing her trunk and walking down that mountain road and finding a train going anywhere at all, away from the lice and the complications and the impossible tangle of loving 3 men who could not seem to tell her the whole truth. But the thought lasted only a moment, because the truth was more complicated than the lie. The truth was that 3 women had come before her and left, and Silas had not told her because he was ashamed, because he was afraid, because every departure had confirmed his deepest fear that he was unlovable, that what he and his brothers were offering was too strange, too much, too far outside the boundaries of the acceptable, and that any woman with sense would run. And Eleanor had not run. She had stayed, had grown into this life the way the gold ring on her finger was growing warm against her skin, had found in 3 imperfect men in an isolated mountain ranch something she had never found in 22 years of proper Boston society. Home. In the morning she came downstairs with her trunk. Silas stood by the fireplace, gray-faced. Bridger sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a cold coffee cup. Colt stood by the window, and for the first time in Eleanor's experience, he had nothing to say. She set the trunk down in the middle of the room. "Tell me everything." Her voice carried no anger, only a quiet, implacable demand for truth. "About the other women, about why they left, about what happened. And then I'll decide," Silas told her. "The first woman came from Missouri, took one look at 3 brothers, and got back on the train the same afternoon. The second came from Pennsylvania, stayed 3 days, barely spoke, left a note on the kitchen table that said, 'I'm sorry, but I can't.' The third came from Virginia, made it a full week before breaking down in tears and asking to be taken to town. None of them stayed long enough to see us." Silas's voice was raw. "To know us, to understand what we were actually offering. And I didn't tell you because I was terrified that if you knew you weren't the first, you'd feel like you weren't special, like you were just the next in line. And you're not. You were never that." Eleanor looked at him, at Bridger, at Colt. Then she pushed the trunk aside with her foot. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go." She spoke the words clearly, wanting each one to land with its full weight. "I'm staying because everywhere else is nowhere without you." Silas crossed the room in 3 strides and gathered her against him. His arms shook, his face pressed into her hair, and Eleanor felt against her cheek the wetness that Silas Calloway would never acknowledge, and she would never mention, and that bound them together more surely than any ring or ceremony or piece of paper ever could. Bridger came from the left, Colt from the right, 4 people standing in the center of a ranch house in the Colorado mountains, holding each other the way survivors hold each other, fiercely and completely, and with the full understanding of what they had nearly lost. Built this together, Eleanor whispered, and it's still standing. That night, the door to their bedroom closed softly. Outside, the last snow of winter had begun to fall light and gentle, nothing like the storms that had come before. The fire burned low. The mountain was quiet. And by morning, everything between them had changed, quietly, irrevocably, completely. Some changes happen in thunder and lightning. Others happen in silence between heartbeats, in the space between one breath and the next. Eleanor's transformation from stranger to wife, from outsider to family, from a woman running away from something to a woman who had finally irrevocably arrived somewhere happened in all of those ways and none of them. It simply happened. The way sunrise happens, the way spring happens, the way home happens when you stop looking for it and realize it has been building itself around you all along. Winter always ends, and this one was ending. The snow was melting, the roads were clearing, and the life that Eleanor Calloway was building with three mountain men on the roof of the world was just beginning. But what that life became in the months and years and decades that followed is a story that deserves its own telling. And that telling comes next. Spring came to the mountain the way grace comes to a hard life. Slowly, reluctantly, and then all at once. The snow retreated up the slopes in stages, revealing ground that Eleanor had never seen without its white covering. Brown earth, gray rock, and then almost overnight green. A green so vivid after months of white that it hurt her eyes not with pain, but with the sheer overwhelming fact of beauty existing in a place that had spent the winter trying to kill everything that lived on it. The roads opened. The creeks thawed and ran loud with meltwater. And with the thaw came news arriving in pieces the way frontier news always did, carried by riders and telegraph, and the slow, unreliable machinery of distance. Marshall Hackett sent word first, a telegram delivered to the Elk Ridge post office. Hackett had checked Garrett's travel records through railroad manifests and hotel registers. Edmund Garrett had been in Colorado Territory 6 years earlier. The dates aligned precisely with the week of Lenora Prescott's death. He had registered at a boarding house in Silver Creek under a different name, James Arden. But the physical description matched, and the handwriting in the hotel ledger was confirmed by a documents examiner as consistent with Garrett's known hand. It was not enough for a murder conviction. Hackett was honest about that. Proximity was not proof. And the only witness Jonas Webb had vanished 6 years ago and left no trail. But it was enough to destroy Edmund Garrett. The investigation attracted the attention of journalists in Denver and Boston who had been quietly collecting stories about Garrett's methods for years. Within 3 months, his license was revoked. His clients abandoned him. He fled east, then south, then vanished from public record entirely. The theft charges were resolved in April. The pawnbroker on Fleet Street swore under oath that he had paid exactly $200. The federal charge was dropped. A territorial judge dismissed the remaining state matter with a note that read, "The complainant's claim appears to have been deliberately inflated to weaponize federal jurisdiction against his own daughter." Case closed with prejudice. Eleanor framed that note, hung it in the ranch office beside the timber contracts, not out of spite, and out of the quiet satisfaction of having been believed. In Pembroke, Lord Reginald Pembroke died in his sleep on a Tuesday in June, 6 months after Eleanor disappeared from the life he had purchased. His fifth wife, a girl of 19 from Philadelphia, survived him and opened his private study to investigators, providing documents that confirmed what the whispers had said for decades. The scandal consumed Boston society for the better part of a year. Eleanor read the news on the porch in the sunshine with Silas's coffee growing cold on the railing beside her. "It's over," Silas said from the doorway. "All of it." "No," Eleanor said, "it's just beginning." The second wedding happened on a morning in May when wildflowers had turned the meadow into a carpet of blue and gold. Eleanor wore a dress of plain white cotton. She wove wildflowers into her hair and stood barefoot in the grass because she wanted to feel the earth of this place beneath her feet when she made her promises. Judge Morrison returned, this time unhurried, this time smiling, this time performing a ceremony that had nothing to do with protection or legal strategy. This time it was about love. After the ceremony, Silas took a knife from his belt and knelt at the front door. Below the word Calloway carved into the oak lintel, years before Eleanor existed in this world, he added a date and a name. Eleanor, cut deep into the grain, permanent. Now it's real, Colt said softly. It was always real, Eleanor replied, from the moment I stepped off that train. The years that followed were not a fairy tale. Eleanor would not have wanted a fairy tale. What she wanted was real. What she got was better than real. It was true, the first spring she planted a garden. It failed. The soil was dense with clay and rock, and she had planted too early, misjudging the mountain seasons. Even the mountain has to learn patience, Bridger told her, kneeling beside the ruined garden with his hands in the dirt. And the mountains have been at it a lot longer than you have. The second spring, Eleanor's garden grew. By the third year, she was selling surplus in Elk Ridge, and the women who had once whispered about the strange Callaway arrangement began stopping at her stall to ask advice about their own stubborn plots. In the summer of the first year, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. The labor was long and frightening, and Bridger delivered the baby because the nearest doctor was 3 days away. Silas paced the hallway until Bridger told him either come in and be useful or go chop something. He came in, held Eleanor's hand, and when the baby arrived, red-faced and furious and perfect, Silas held her in arms that had built fences and broken horses and carried Eleanor through blizzards, and those arms trembled. They named her Lenora. It was Eleanor's idea. She deserves to be remembered, Eleanor said, placing the baby in Silas's arms. And our daughter deserves her name. Silas looked at the child, looked at his wife, and wept. For the first time since a clear October afternoon 6 years before, for the first time in front of another living soul. By the second autumn, the neighbors had stopped whispering. When a storm tore the roof off the Henderson barn 3 miles down the valley, the Callaway brothers arrived first, rebuilt it in 2 days, did not ask for payment. Actions, not words, Silas said when old Henderson tried to thank him. That's what a good man does. After that, nobody in Elk Ridge had much to say about the Callaway family arrangement. In the third year, winter came hard. Half the herd died. They sat together by the fire on the worst night, too exhausted to speak. Eleanor held Silas's hand on one side, Bridger's on the other. Her foot rested against Colt's boot. We'll get through this, Eleanor said eventually, because someone had to say it. We always do. In the 5th year, they lost old Henderson. He died in his sleep on a cold November night. Silas dug the grave by hand, 6 hours in frozen ground, because Henderson had been the first neighbor to treat them like human beings instead of curiosities. Eleanor brought coffee to the gravesite, did not speak, did not offer platitudes. She simply stood beside her husband in the cold and let him know he was not alone. That's what love looks like sometimes, she thought. Not words, just showing up. Twins arrived in the 4th year. Boys, William and Daniel. Identical in face and temperament, in the specific brand of chaos they inflicted on a household that had been, until their arrival, a model of frontier efficiency. Grace came in the 7th year. She attached herself to Silas like a burr to wool and refused to detach, and the sight of the biggest, hardest man in the territory walking around with a 3-year-old clinging to his leg became one of the small, daily miracles that Eleanor collected in her memory, the way other women collected china. The ranch grew. Eleanor managed the contracts. Her legal mind became the operation's greatest asset. Silas ran the timber operation. Bridger managed the livestock, his episodes decreasing as Eleanor helped him correspond with doctors in Denver. Colt trained horses for the cavalry, a contract Eleanor had secured through legal research and sheer audacity. Built this together, Silas said one evening on the porch. Every fence post, every beam, every child, every winter. And it's still standing. Still standing, Eleanor agreed. Still growing. 10 years after a frightened girl stepped off a train into nothing. Eleanor Callaway stood on the porch and watched her family in the golden light of a September afternoon. Lenore 9 was helping Bridger tend to a horse. The twins were building a fort while Colt pretended not to notice. And Grace sat on Silas's shoulders while he inspected the barn roof, shrieking with delight. A rider appeared on the road. Young, federal marshal's uniform, uncertain face. Marshal Thomas Wright, ma'am. I'm here about a complaint filed 10 years ago. Marriage fraud. My office is closing old cases. Silas met him with Eleanor's hand in his. That complaint was filed by a man whose own conduct is under investigation in 3 states. We've been married a decade, 4 children. Most successful operation in the district. Wright looked at the ranch, at the children, at the 4 adults who stood together with the easy unity of people who have weathered a decade of storms. I can see that, he smiled. I have everything I need. Sorry to have bothered you folks. He rode away until he was nothing against the vast landscape. That evening, after the children were asleep, Eleanor sat in the library with her three men. She pulled an envelope from her pocket. A letter from my father, forwarded through multiple addresses. He died last year. The brothers waited. He left me nothing in his will, but he wrote me a final letter. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky. My dearest Margaret, I write to you a broken man, knowing I wronged you beyond any hope of forgiveness. I sold my daughter to save my pride, and in doing so, I lost everything that mattered. I followed your life from a distance through newspaper accounts of the Callaway Ranch. I am told you are happy, that you have children, that you have built something real. I am glad. You deserve better than I gave you, better than I could ever be. I hope someday you can forgive me, though I have no right to ask. Your father, Cornelius. Eleanor folded the letter. Set it on the table. I forgave him years ago. I had to, or the bitterness would have poisoned everything we built. I wasn't willing to give him that power. Colt shook his head. You're a better person than me. I'd have danced on his grave, maybe. But holding anger only hurts the person carrying it. I'd rather carry love. There's more room for it, and it weighs less. Silas pulled her close. His hand found its place on the small of her back, the place it had been finding for 10 years. That's why we love you, he said. Not just because you're brave or smart or stubborn enough to argue a timber contract into the ground. Because you choose kindness over bitterness. You build instead of destroy. You forgive instead of punish. And you taught all three of us how to do the same. I learned it from you, Eleanor said. All three of you. You showed me what love looks like, what it does, how it stays. The fire settled. The wind moved against the walls of the house that Silas had built and Bridger had made warm, and Colt had filled with laughter, and Eleanor had turned into a home. 4 people sat together in the quiet of a life they had earned. The letter from Cornelius Whitfield would be filed away in the morning, put in the drawer with the other artifacts of a life Eleanor had left behind. The pawn ticket, the train schedule, the torn advertisement that had started everything. But tonight she would simply exist in the present, in the warmth of the fire, in the company of 3 men who had chosen her, fought for her, built a life with her that defied every expectation and exceeded every hope. She still remembered stepping off that train into nothing, the cold that bit through her cloak, the mountains that made her feel small. 3 men on a frozen platform who looked at her like she was the answer to a prayer they had never spoken aloud. 10 years later, standing in a house built by their hands surrounded by children who carried pieces of all of them, watching the fire burn low and the stars appear through the window, Eleanor Callaway understood something that the frightened girl on that platform could not have imagined. She understood that home is not a place you find. It is a thing you build, board by board, day by day, choice by choice, with hands that are sometimes steady and sometimes shaking, and always reaching for each other. The mountains had not changed. She had. Some women spend their lives waiting for one great love. Eleanor had been blessed with 3, and she would not trade a single moment of it. Not the blizzards, not the fear, not the impossible choice on a frozen platform, not the nights of doubt or the mornings of joy or the long, ordinary days in between that were in the end the most precious days of all. You're home now, Silas said quietly, the way he had said it 1,000 times before, the way he would say it 1,000 times more, right where you're supposed to be. I know, Eleanor said. I've known for a long time. She leaned her head against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and listened to the sound of the house settling around them, the small creaks and sighs of timber and stone, doing what they were built to do. Holding, sheltering, standing. Some loves are worth walking through blizzards for. Eleanor's was worth everything. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story stayed with you, if it found a place somewhere in your chest where the good stories live, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button. I've got another frontier tale coming next week, and I think you're going to want to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me what part of Eleanor's story hit you the hardest. I read every single one. Until next time.